is open. This session forms part of the examination of the Greater Norwich Local Plan. My name is Mike Warden, and with my colleague Thomas Hatfield, who is visible on the screen. We are inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination and to report to the partnership in due course. So everybody can hear me. Can everyone please ensure that they are muted and that any mobile phones are turned off or silent to avoid any distractions? This is the third block of hearing sessions being held as part of the examination. We sat in February and March last year, and then we came back in July, where we discussed the East Norwich Regeneration Area site. Today, we're discussing the potential modification to Policy 2 in response to the nutrient neutrality issues raised in the written ministerial statement of last year. And then tomorrow, we're discussing some outstanding matters relating to housing land supply, which we needed to return to in the light of the partnership updating the housing trajectory following our earlier sessions. There will inevitably be some crossover between the 2 days, particularly as some of the changes to the housing trajectory result from assumptions about the impact of nutrient neutrality work and mechanisms that have to be carried out. So we don't want to repeat evidence over the 2 days, but it might be that some discussions today might help us tomorrow and may reduce the need for some of our questions tomorrow. Before I move on to today's session, I have some general questions which I'd like to ask the partnership. But before I ask the questions, I think it would be helpful for the partnership to introduce its team. I know that we've got some new participants from previous sessions, and so I think I'm going to turn to Mr. Hal Williams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Nice to meet you.
And you both. I hope I can be heard loud and clear.
You can.
I'm here to be part of the team for the partnership and to assist you both during the course of today and tomorrow. I'll now pass over to Mr. Burrell, who will be the first of the team to introduce himself.
Good morning. I'm Mike Burrell. I'm the manager of the Greater Norwich Local Plan team. So I will be appearing today in relation to nutrient neutrality. I'll pass you over now to my colleague Phil Courtier.
Good morning. As you've heard, my name is Phil Courtier. I am Director of Place for both Broadland and South Norfolk Councils. I'm a Director of Greater Norwich, and I'm also the Lead Director for Nutrient Neutrality across the Norfolk catchment, and I've been leading on that work. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm Stuart Bisley, independent property consultant, have been assisting MPS Group in preparation of the viability appraisal work. So I'm here today to assist the GNLP team in respect of any matters that are raised in connection with viability.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll invite everyone else to introduce themselves in a moment, but before we start on the subject for today, I just wonder if the partnership could just update us in relation to the ongoing work in relation to gypsies and travellers. Essentially, how is it going? Are we still on track? And can we assume that we'll be returning to sessions in July on gypsies and travellers?
Thank you, sir. Yes, in short, we are on track and we will be returning to sessions in July on gypsies and travellers. We have recently completed a consultation that finished on Monday, 2 days ago. We will be taking reports to the newly formed councils in June, and therefore we anticipate being prepared for hearings in July.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Thank you. Mr. Hatfield, is there anything that you wish to ask Mr. Ball about that point?
Nothing further at this stage, no. Thank you.
Thank you. So on to the session today then, and I'm not going to repeat the opening statements that were made earlier at previous sessions, but I just want to make a few points, particularly since we have some new participants with us today. First of all, on the practical side, please use your hand raise function if you would like to speak and when you'd like to speak. All questions will come through us. It's worked very well to date in this examination, and most of you are then familiar with the procedure. If you lose your connection and you can't get back in, then please contact Annette, who you've all met, and she will do her best to help. And she will also advise us what is happening, and if necessary, we'll take a pause. The event is being live streamed on YouTube. We will take breaks in mid-morning and at lunch, mid-afternoon. We're not expecting today's session to last all day, and we'll see how it goes. If people need to have a break at times that we haven't, before we say so effectively, then please do so. We're fairly relaxed on that, and it can be quite tiring sat in front of a screen. So please just indicate to us if you'd like a break. So just a few points about the examination, and just to remind you that our task is to consider the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria in the National Planning Framework, and also whether it is legally compliant. And the hearings, including today's, are intending to assist us in that regard. And in submitting the plan, the partnership originally considered that it was sound, and this was the starting point for the examination. So if you're challenging the soundness of the plan, then you need to explain why it is unsound and what changes need to be made to make it sound. Clearly, though, at this stage, the partnership are suggesting changing for soundness in relation to today's session. So for soundness and legal compliance reasons. So it is a proposed change to the plan from that originally submitted, and we understand the reasons why. Mr. Hatfield and I are examining the plan jointly. Both of us will be active in today's sessions. It's likely that one of us will lead off on each question, but questions may come from either of us. We have read and will take into account the hearing statements that have been prepared, and also, where relevant, the original representations that were made. There's no need for these to be repeated, and written submissions have the same rate as verbal submissions. I just want to refer once again to the issue of omission sites. These are sites which have been put forward on, or the partnership may have considered for allocations during the preparation of the plan, but have not been included within the submitted version. This is very important, as a number of representations to the plan relate to such sites. We're examining the soundness of the submitted plan, and omission sites are not part of the submitted plan, and it is not our role to examine the soundness of omission sites. And subject to legal right to be heard, such sites will not normally be discussed at these hearing sessions. But even in the submissions on this week's topics, some representatives have made reference to omission sites. For example, in their case that there will be a deficit of housing land, and there is a site that we own which we could bring forward, that kind of thing. But we're not discussing such sites. They're simply not part of the submitted plan. As was the case with the previous sessions, it is open to the partnership to propose further changes to the plan at any stage, and we'd ask that they keep a record of any possible changes that arise during the hearing sessions. Any main modifications will be the subject of future consultation. This is a general point. If we need to talk directly to the partnership about progress on work which we've asked for, we will make reference to that before the hearing sessions close. We'll not invite others to contribute to such sessions because they're procedural only, but participants will be able to observe. Just a reminder that the examination remains open until our report is submitted to the partnership, and at the final So we turn then to today's session, and I would now like all participants in today's session to introduce themselves, other than obviously I've heard from. Is there anything you wish to say? You've just come on screen.
Inspector, your screen and sound is buffering for me. I don't know if it's the same for everyone else. We've got nods. It is. I don't know if you've got issues there with your connection.
Okay.
it was only momentarily towards the end of your
Yeah.
conversation that you fell out, but obviously I'd like to let you know as soon as possible.
Yeah, thank you. If you can, if that happens and it's a problem, then Mr. Hatfield will jump in. But please let me know. I'm not sure as much I can do about it at the moment, but please let me know, and I'll try to restart my router if there's a problem or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so can we turn then to the participants for today's session, and I'll just go through the list that I've got on the programme, on the published programme, and ask people to introduce themselves. For Barrett, David Wilson Holmes, please. Pegasus.
Yes, good morning. Ed Durrant from Pegasus Group on behalf of Barrett, David Wilson Holmes. Thank you.
Thank you. David Wilson Holmes and Pigeon and Savills.
Good morning, sir. It's Jonathan Dixon.
Good morning, Mr. Dixon. For Berliet Holmes.
Yeah, morning, sir. It's Berliet Limited and Hannah Leary from Barton Wilmore, now Stantec. Thank you.
Thank you. For Holsbury.
I'll start. It's myself, Heather Pugh from David Locke Associates, and Harry Bennett is also on the call as well. We'll do it between us. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Again, yeah, Harry Bennett from Litchfields. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you again. And for Hingham Town Council.
Hi, yeah, it's me again. It's Ali from Hingham Town Council.
Thank you. Now, Hingham Town Council have not submitted representations on this particular matter.
No, I wasn't entirely sure whether we were able to or not. Lots of information came in at the same time, unfortunately, in a very short space of time. So I kind of struggled with what we were able to do and what we weren't. I basically have probably about 3 questions. It's just we're in the middle of our neighbourhood plan, so this hearing is quite important, just to be able just to have probably a brief say on about 3 things.
Okay. We'll just be clear, we're not missed a representation. Land stock estates, and again, we've not got, I don't think, a representation from you, Mr. Tuddenham.
No, that's correct, sir. As you know, in earlier sessions, I was working alongside Halsbury, and that continues. There is a very late representation I would like to make as we move through today as a result of things that happened last week at a South Norfolk Council committee meeting that does impact upon neutrality. It's something that's occurred since we were last invited to make representations.
Okay, thank you. Natural England.
Good morning, sir. I'm Louise Oliver. I'm the case officer for the Greater Norwich Local Plan, and I'm here today with my colleague, Carrie Switton, Senior Advisor.
Thank you. And just so we're clear, in terms of Natural England's position, you've worked with the partnership and worked on a statement of common ground.
Yes.
So the proposed modification, which we're discussing today, is you're fully supportive of that. So effectively, you are supporting the partnership's position today. Is that correct?
Yes, we've signed a statement of common ground to just sort of set out the context, and we're here to provide any assistance we can to the inspectors in terms of nutrient neutrality and Natural England's position and role as it affects the Greater Norwich Local Plan.
Okay, thank you. And Terra Strategic, please.
Good morning. Yes, it's James Bonner from Barton Wilmore, now Stantec.
Thank you. And Orbit Homes.
So yes, David Jones from Armstrong Road Planning on behalf of Orbit.
And finally, Welbeck Land.
Good morning, sirs. James Bailey and Jamie Martin Edwards on behalf of Welbeck Land, as you say.
Okay, thank you. And I think that should be everybody. Is that is there anyone who I've not invited to introduce themselves? No, good. Right, thank you. Such an efficient programme officer, you see. Okay, thank you. Right, we'll start on matter 4, and we'll deal with the questions that we've set out. I'm going to take the first question, and I would just like to start off really by inviting the partnership to just tell us briefly where they are now. Obviously, I know that there is a proposed modification, and we'll come on to discuss the wording of that and what it might mean. But can you just tell us very briefly, just to update us, the work that you've done and where you are now in relation to nutrient neutrality? Just a brief overview, please.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'll begin on this, and I'll invite my colleague Phil Courtier to provide a little bit more detail. But as you say, we'll keep it brief. So we've agreed the proposed amendments to the policy with Natural England. That's in the Statement of Common Ground. We're now moving on at pace with implementing the nutrient neutrality strategy. So I'll just point to some different aspects of this. And I think in terms of question 16, the most relevant section of our evidence is pages 2 to 7 of our hearing statement, which sets out how the policy is justified, effective and consistent with national policy. So the first aspect I'd like to point out to you is how our policy addresses the government's statement, their July statement, Water Quality and Nutrient Neutrality, WMS. So that's set out in document 4.1. Like also to point out to the fact that the policy reflects the fact that we are the competent authorities and therefore requires us to undertake HRAs. And then thirdly, most relevant to your question, is active use is being made of both the funding that has been available from government and funding from the local authorities to progress the Norfolk nutrient strategy mitigation solutions, and that was document G 2.2. Further work on the strategy is ongoing and is due for completion very soon. This will provide mitigation solutions from April 2023. Then you may wish to ask Natural England about a bit more about this, but also in parallel, Natural England are working on mitigation solutions. And also, importantly, we're working very closely with Anglian Water in relation to upgrades to their wastewater treatment works, which are in line with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. It has been considered in the House of Commons, is currently being considered by the House of Lords. We're informed by a Planning Advisory Service that is likely to gain royal assent in April. So an important aspect of that is that the costs associated with nutrient neutrality are likely to fall post 2030. So could I invite my colleague Phil Courtier to add a little bit more information about the ongoing work?
Yes, please, Mr. Ball. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Before I start, excuse me, I'm going to cough. Before I start, there's a danger I could talk for about 20 minutes and you think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of information. What I can describe is the implementation of our work to alleviate the nutrient neutrality issue. Is that what is most helpful to you, sir?
Yes, please. Yeah. So I don't expect you to talk for 20 minutes, but if you could.
I won't. I promise you, I won't. So Obviously, nutrient neutrality hit us last March, along with lots of other authorities. We immediately worked on looking at our own nutrient budget calculator that was adopted last year. That is, in my opinion, a more robust methodology and assumptions, but also reduces the burden upon nutrients arising from new development. But since then, we've been working exceptionally hard across a partnership of 5 local authorities, but crucially for today, the 3 Greater Norwich authorities across the catchment, and also crucially and uniquely in this country with Anglian Water, to set up a joint venture partnership, a not-for-profit company limited by guarantee, including those local authorities and Anglian Water, which creates a trading platform where it can acquire, buy, wholesale mitigation arising from large-scale mitigation projects. But that's a portfolio of different projects, from upgrades to water infrastructure, to nature-based solutions, to the conversion of septic tanks, etc., etc. So a portfolio of solutions. But the joint venture doesn't own those projects, it simply buys the mitigation arising from them, divides that up into proportionate credits that developers can then buy. That joint venture, we're now at a point where 4 out of those 5 councils have agreed through their formal processes to join that joint venture. The other one, Norwich City, has endorsed the joint venture, set aside the money to join that joint venture, but is just waiting to the next civic year to review that matter before it does join. Anglian Water are also fully engaged and continue to go through the process to also formally agree to join the joint venture. We are intending that that joint venture effectively goes live next month in April, with the intention to trade as soon as possible. At the same time, significant amount of work is going into securing that pipeline of mitigation projects where that mitigation can be acquired, as well as setting up the governance, the trading mechanisms, the credit allocation processes. At the same time, you'll be aware that in the budget, the Chancellor announced the creation, the establishment of a significant fund for local credit allocation schemes. As we are at the vanguard of the concept of local allocation credit schemes, then we are well placed to access that fund as and when it becomes available. I'm told that that will be a matter of, they are desperate to get that money out, so it's not a long-term thing. We will hopefully be available in the relatively short term. In addition to that, we are seeking other sources of funding for that joint venture, whether it's through the Greater Norwich Partnership and Pooled SIL, whether it's through capital funding from Anglian Water or DEFRA, or even we've had conversations with private investment funds, but I think that's an unnecessary route to go down. At the same time, we're setting up technical advisory groups, which includes bodies such as Natural England, as well as UEA, who are academically leading in this sort of field, as well as other organisations like the Norfolk Rivers Trust, to provide an advisory group to that joint venture to make sure that the assumptions that it's making are robust. We've appointed a general manager on a permanent contract into that. That person will be starting in May. So I think, as I say, I could go on for a lot longer. There's a huge number of work streams, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that this is not just a concept. This is something that is now being established, will be going live soon, and will be trading soon.
Thank you. Before I invite Natural England to add to it, the situation now in relation to planning applications for determination that are affected by the nutrient neutrality issue, what is the situation on those? Have any of these measures meant that permissions can be granted?
No, to date, those applications are, in the vast majority of cases, unless there are some exceptional circumstances or where a developer, generally on the larger schemes, has come up with their own solution. So the joint venture is not intending to meet 100% of the need for nutrient mitigation in this area, because the large schemes can generally find their own solutions. They're equipped and able to do that. So those that are still held up and haven't got their own solutions are still held up on the basis that under the habitats regulations, you need a greater degree of security of the delivery of that mitigation. And although we're very advanced with the joint venture, there's still a need to go that further step and be securing the mitigation and be able to give such assurance to Natural England that that mitigation is in place.
But are some permissions being granted because of other solutions outside of the process you've just described?
So, and I'm not sure, Mr. Tudden referred to a case recently at South Norfolk. For example, South Norfolk last week considered the Long Stratton development of circa 1,800 homes, where there is a proposition for its own solution to be found. Now, there's still some work to be done in finalising the nutrient neutrality strategy. There's still some work to be done on the Section 106, but that is heading towards an approval because they have come up with their own solution, which includes the fallowing of land, which includes potential upgrades to water infrastructure, which includes a fallback position of a wetland that can be created within the land ownership of landowners associated with that site. So in that situation, you can see a developer, a promoter has come up with their own solution, which is not relying upon the joint venture credit allocation scheme.
Thank you. Natural England, do you want to add anything to what Mr. Coultier has outlined?
Thank you, sir. We support the approach that the partnership are adopting in principle in devising mitigation schemes. But again, it comes down to sort of the detail and seeing what can be practically delivered and acting as effective mitigation on the ground. So we've provided assistance and advice to the partnership. We note we've provided detailed comments on the Norfolk calculator to the partnership in a letter that we wrote in October last year, and I think that's been submitted to you as part of the evidence from the partnership. But we really need to see sort of full details of the scheme and the credits and exactly how it will be implemented before we can really comment in much more detail. I don't know, Caris, if you want to say any more, but that's really our position.
Yeah, I don't really have much anything more to add. Just that we do have representation on the technical group that Phil mentioned to work in collaboration with the joint venture group. But in terms of detail, like Louise has outlined, we haven't actually been formally asked to comment on the arrangements that Phil outlined earlier.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We will come back to look at on our question 18 about is the strategy likely to be successful. So we will have we've got some further questions in relation to the detail, but I think as an opening to where we are, I think that's fairly helpful background. Thank you very much. Can I just Hingham Town Council, you've got a question or you want to raise a point?
Could I just ask that if at any point in the future that strategy, policy and the evidence base will actually go out to a full consultation?
Mr. Coultier, do you want to?
Yeah. So the strategy that Mr. Burrells referred to is a strategy that was prepared by Royal Haskoning on behalf of the local authorities in Norfolk that have been affected by nutrient neutrality. That strategy simply sets out a whole array of different mitigation measures and how effective they can be or otherwise. And they give us lots of figures as to, well, if you implement riparian buffer strips in the Wensum, you're likely to be able to mitigate X amount of kilograms of phosphate and nitrates. And if you do it in the Broads, it'll be a slightly different figure. And it gives us lots of information on which the joint venture can now base decisions in terms of which mitigation it prioritizes and which it delivers first. And so it's primarily a strategy for the joint venture to inform the joint venture and the respective council partners, rather than a document that's simply going to go out to consultation. It's much more of a technical guide for the joint venture. So in short answer, it is likely to be published in due course, but it's not something that is then subject to a whole series of consultations.
Thank you. Mr. Burrell.
Yeah, just to add, so the question was asked about policy as well. So this policy will be subject to consultation through the main modifications to the plan.
Thank you. Will that be like a full public 6 weeks advertised consultation with the start date and an end date, say similar to you've recently done with the Gypsy and Traveller?
Well, yes, I mean there will be a whole host of modifications that will relate to the plan. If we consider that the change that has been proposed to us is to go forward as a modification, and whether that's amended, then that modification will be subject to the statutory consultation for the normal periods. Yes. Does that help you?
Yeah, I think so. And also the evidence base. Obviously, we got sent something very late yesterday for today's hearing. Is any of that evidence base going to be allowed to be have representation made regarding it?
Well, in respect of the evidence base, which is supporting the work that has been done and the proposed modification, that's evidence base. That's technical. We're not inviting any comments on that. You've had a chance to make representations on this matter, and we're not inviting any additional representations on the evidence base. You'll be able to make comments on modifications, which is policy modification.
Okay, thank you. It's just that there seems to be a glaring omission in some of the evidence and the documents that we've been sent with regard to triple SIs, and that Hingham has not been included at all. We have a triple SI in Hingham, which seems to be completely missing from everything that I've had a chance to read.
Mr. Guttier might want to respond to that, but we're not, we're it becomes a little bit distant from what we need to discuss now, which is the policy wording. And you're perfectly entitled to talk to the partnership outside of this this hearing session. But Mr. Courtier or Louise Oliver might want to come in here.
Thank you. I can just clarify the site of special scientific interest that you're referring to in Hingham is designated under national domestic legislation, but it's not been designated as a site that's covered by the habitats regulation. So it's not an internationally important site. And that's why Hingham is not covered, because it's an SSSI, but it's not a component site of a European site of a special area of conservation or special protected area or an international Ramsar site. So that's why that SSSI, it doesn't apply. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I turn to the policy, which we've now got in your statement, which is results from the statement of common ground, that an amendment, effectively a modification to policy 2, and that is set out in your statement. Can I just ask, in a general sense, the wording of that policy, is that common amongst those authorities outside of the GNLP that are dealing with this, or is this something which is bespoke to this particular issue and the evidence which you have produced and relying on in Greater Norwich?
Thank you. So I'll respond on that point. So we've worked on this policy, a bespoke policy, with Natural England. We believe that it addresses the key point, which is ensuring that relevant planning permissions will only be granted with necessary neutrality mitigation in place prior to the occupation of relevant development and in compliance with the habitats regulations. So that's the key, to my mind, the key point of the policy. I am aware of one other area in the country that has been impacted by nutrient neutrality that has gone through examination. That's Folkestone and Hythe. We have looked at their policy. They have a broadly similar policy. Theirs is slightly more detailed, but takes the same focus of ensuring that any development that takes place addresses the habitats regulations.
Thank you. So can you just explain to me the change that you are now seeking in terms of the modification? Because so I'm looking at the response to your partnership response to question 16. Is it that word in there which is in italics that is the main modification that
Yes.
you are putting forward before us?
Yes, it is. So that's in the hearing statement on question 16. In the introduction section, it's a new section in policy 2, and that wording is in italics, and it's also in the statement of common. The same wording is in the statement of common ground, which is contained in document G 2.1, which is the partnership's nutrient neutrality evidence document. So that's the same.
Okay, thank you. And is it 10 because that in the other modifications to policy 2, this would become 10?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry, that's a slight cause of confusion, but there are other modifications required to policy 2. There will be.
Yeah. Thank you. So, in that sense, then, and looking at, I'm looking at the wording here and how it fits into policy 2. So, policy 2, those 10 criteria within policy 2 sit within effectively a sentence that says, to achieve this, development proposals are required as appropriate to. And then I realise I've not got other modifications to this policy before me, but they ensure, make provision, contribute to, make efficient, respect, provide, create, support, those words. And this one then starts off with a different wording. It says within the catchments. So it doesn't necessarily fit within the same criteria unless other modifications are made to effectively the first sentence, first paragraph of that policy, or this becomes a separate part of that policy. Do you see what I mean?
I do. I mean, the proposed amendment includes must, because this is not, it's not advisory. It's a absolute requirement that nutrient neutrality must be provided for. So I do understand your point, sir, and perhaps we should consider separating it out from those other points.
Okay, Mr. Hatfield.
Just a brief point in relation to policy 2, which I think I led the discussion on in the initial hearings. The work there have been, the partnership have shared with us quite a lot of detailed amendments to that policy. So it will change substantially, including the first paragraph. I think my recollection was I raised concerns about the wording of the first paragraph to policy 2.
Yeah.
And so there will be substantial changes to that and other sections of policy based on some of the comments we had in the hearing session last year. But just if that helps.
Yeah.
Obviously, with a plan of this nature, myself and Mr. Warden have divvied up the various policies, and I did lead on policy 2.
And we're dealing. Thank you. That's very helpful. And we're also dealing with a policy that's, we're discussing amendments to policy over quite a period of time. So we need to make sure that if we accept this modification, that the wording just means that it flows and makes sense as a policy. So effectively, it is effective. There's a question, though, in relation to the first bullet point, which maybe you can help me with. It says residential development that results in an increase in the number of overnight accommodation. Is that right in terms of the way it's set out? Results in an increase in the number of overnight accommodation. Should it be the
amount,
level of overnight accommodation?
Yeah, the level, or yes. Sorry, that's poor drafting. That should be level or amount of overnight accommodation.
Yeah, and just tell me further. That just this issue about overnight accommodation. I understand what it means, but doesn't residential accommodation, by its definition, isn't that overnight accommodation, or is it designed to only relate to? Is it only relate to the increase? So it's not where development is lost and not. So it's no net increase, or I'm not sure I understand the relevance of residential development and overnight accommodation.
I could ask my colleague Phil Courtier to comment on this.
Thank you.
I think that wording is taken from effectively the DEFRA and Natural England letters back in March last year, which referred to overnight accommodation on the basis that it could include effectively campsites, tents, tourist accommodation, hotels. So it was trying to be a catch-all rather than residential accommodation, which gives a degree of effectively permanency to it. So it does include potentially hospitals as well as dwellings.
But isn't that covered by the second bullet point?
And look, again, I think I'm going to turn back to Mr. Burrell in a minute and say I think that term overnight accommodation is simply taken from the letters written in March last year from those organisations and bodies, but it doesn't need to adhere to it necessarily in the policy.
Yeah. I'm not trying to catch you out. I'm just trying to look at what the appropriate wording might be.
Absolutely.
So that it avoids any confusion or ambiguity about what it actually means, and that we don't have more words than we actually need.
Yeah, could I come back? So the second bullet point is non-residential development that by virtue of its scale or type may draw people from outside the catchment of the SACs. So I think we could revisit those two bullet points and how they relate to each other in the light of the questions you have asked to see if we can streamline them, clarify them. Would that be helpful, sir?
Yes, please. As I say, we're just trying to just trying to get the wording right so that it makes sense to us inspectors who might be dealing with an appeal before that someone throws a policy at. Louise Oliver.
Thank you. And I agree with what's been said with the ambiguity. of this, and I think I'm kind of guilty as well, having seen various drafts and iterations working with Mike Burrell, that I do think it does need some clarification. Otherwise, I can see that developers will be saying, well, it's not a residential development, it falls outside scope. So I think it would be welcomed to sort of redo the wording here to make it less confusing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so that's an action point that we'd like you to look at. There is, in relation as well to the modification, there is, and it's not in here, but it's in not in your statement, but it's in the other document about explanatory text.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether there's also an opportunity in there to be clear about what the policy means. So we might need, whether that is a main modification or an additional modification, we won't know until we look at it. But there's also an opportunity there to make changes to that text such that it is clear what the policy means and how it should be operated.
Thank you, sir. That's noted. It would, I assume it would be helpful to you if we could provide the detail of the explanatory text with any suggested changes, so that at present what we have in the Statement of Common Ground is a set of bullet points on what the supplementary text should cover, but we can provide that in as a draft detailed change.
Yes, you'll need to do that, whether that's an additional modification or a main modification. Obviously, if for going out for consultation, you'll need to have the detail. So you'll have to do the work anyway, so it will help us, and we can work out which parts are main modification. And it may be that it might all be because it relates to the policy change, or it may be that some might be additional modifications, but we won't know. But I suppose I'm inviting you to look at this wording again so that it'll work, and then make consequential changes to the supporting text, and put those to us as a proposal.
Thank you. We will do that.
Thank you. Mr. Hatfield, is there anything you wish to say in relation to that policy wording before we move on a little bit?
No further comments from me at this stage. No, thank you.
Thank you. Hannah Leary, you've got your hand up. Would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you, sir. And apologies to interrupt, because I appreciate that this is a discussion between the partnership and yourselves, but I just thought it might be worth adding. I've been working on another strategic site in the zone of influence around the Chilterns Beechwoods SAC recently, and the local authorities there have had to grapple with a similar issue, albeit related to recreational impact on the SAC. And Central Bedfordshire Council have recently published some guidance in relation to the SAC and their mitigation package, which includes within it a table which sets out which uses, which residential uses are relevant in relation to mitigation measures that are required. It may be worth the partnership having a look at that, just to understand how they presented that information in terms of which uses, residential uses, are or are not relevant in relation to the mitigation package proposed.
I mean, that's sort of partnership to look and put to us anything that they wish to do in response to what we've raised. If you want to have regard to what might be considered as best practice somewhere else, then please do so. But you've put to us a proposal. We've got some questions on the wording, which we've asked you to look at. So,
yes, as I stated, we will review that policy, and that will include looking at other best practice.
Okay. Obviously, we don't want significant changes that would mean that we'd have to come back and discuss it again. I think if you could take on board certainly the points that we're making, then that would be helpful. Just a question in relation to its operation. We've got questions later on, but a question in relation to the policy now is that, is it the intention that that this policy, whatever in final form, would be adopted in an operational sense prior to the adoption of the local plan?
Well, it's in effect being used in that we referred earlier to a Long Stratton planning application that's being considered. There will shortly be in April, there'll be a major application for, very likely to be a major application for Anglia Square considered. So the requirement to meet to address the HRA is effectively being done already, because that is national legislation that must be addressed.
Thank you. Just going back to a point on the, well, I'm looking at the supplementary text that you're going to put forward. I have a point that I wasn't sure. This is just something for you to look at, because I think you need to look at this wording again. But there was in the list of bullet points, as you referred to, which it wasn't clear whether they would be supporting text or whether they just be supporting text would take account of these bullet points.
That's intent. Sorry.
Yeah. So I maybe then the answer is dealt with, but the question I had was that I couldn't see a big difference between bullet point 3 and bullet point 4. I don't need to look at them now, but I think that it would be, as I said, what we would need to see is supporting text. So however you arrive at it, following the the information set out in Statement of Common Ground, we need to see that supporting text. It's clear in some senses what it could be focused on and how it will be the main points of it, but you'll need to write it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I don't have any more questions in relation to question 16. Is there any points that any other participant wishes to make in relation to question 16? Some hands going up. Heather Pugh has got a hand up.
Thank you, sir. It's just following on from your last point on the supporting text. Just specifically, I think you're right. The third and fourth bullet points are a little confusing, but I would just welcome in any clarifications that are made, sort of how the definition of in place and secured is meant, because it's a bit ambivalent. I mean, Long Stratton has been approved, resolution to grant subject to the agreement. The things aren't agreed yet, and I think the appropriate assessment and HRA aren't yet agreed. So I think it's got a resolution to grant, and it will be decided before the decision notice is issued. But I think just a bit of clarification in terms of what in place means. Does that mean an agreed strategy on paper, or does that mean something on site? And I think the similar point in the fourth bullet point about on-site or off-site mitigation has been secured. Does that mean on paper or on the ground? So I think it would help for the determination of applications in the short to medium term, that if that could be clarified through the policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Just one point I picked up now. It's not in our written submission, but just I'd missed it before. Just a point of whether there is a need for clarity over the definition of catchments. There is the surface water catchment of the rivers, but then there are the sewage catchments, which sometimes span outside of the surface water catchments but discharge into that surface water catchment. So a new house can be outside of the river catchments but have sewage that flows into the river catchments. So it's whether there's a more clarification needed on that point.
Does the partnership wish to say anything in relation to that point made by Mr. Jones?
I note that point again in reviewing the policy and in authoring the text, we can take account of that. That's something that would benefit from clarification, I'm sure.
Thank you. Hannah Leary, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, sir. Before I carry on, I would like to thank the partnership for the efforts they've made to bring forward a mitigation solution quite so quickly. I completely appreciate that this has been something they've had to react to very quickly. So, we welcome the work that's been undertaken by them in partnership with Natural England. And obviously we understand that this needs to be accommodated somewhere within policy. So again, we welcome that effort. In terms of the effectiveness, I had one question which I did raise in my written rep, but the point around unfavourable condition, sites that are in an unfavourable condition, there needs to be presumably somewhere along the line a test linked into this policy, which is assessing in the background on a regular basis whether the sites do remain in a favourable or unfavourable condition in order to assess whether or not any further mitigation is required. Is there a mechanism in place to do that, and how will that operate, would be my question. Clearly, we shouldn't be mitigating for circumstances in which sites are in favourable condition, and presumably once mitigation is put into place, their condition may alter, and therefore that policy may need to be updated.
Thank you. I mean, partnership might want to take it, but I can see that Louise Oliver's got a hand up as well. I don't know whether that's a question or whether whether you want to come in to help us on this point.
Thank you, sir. Unfavourable condition is defined sort of within the context of the habitats regulations, and for each of these sites, these European sites, there are a set of conservation objectives which explain how the features for which those sites are notified are to be either restored if need be or maintained in favourable conservation status. So it's a case of Natural England, and in this case Environment Agency, with their monitoring stations, monitoring the discharges of phosphorus and nitrogen into the watercourses. Obviously with the Environment Agency it will be regular monitoring, so it would be on the basis of partly the water quality sampling made with the discharges downstream to the Broads catchment, if that improves in time, together with condition monitoring that Natural England undertakes of those sites to see, are those features present? Are they increasing, decreasing? And that is all published and made available. So in terms of monitoring whether these sites move from unfavourable status to favourable, there will be information published, and we will obviously, in case of nutrient neutrality, be communicating that to local planning authorities that are affected by the nutrient neutrality work. So I think it will be covered. I mean, I think what will be interesting, as much as monitoring the designated sites, is making sure as part of this mitigation strategy that there's effective monitoring of the mitigation solutions that are being implemented to make sure that they are actually functioning properly, and the sort of theoretical removal of phosphorus and nitrogen does actually happen and they do work effectively on the ground, because if they don't on an individual basis, then we will still be facing this problem in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Hannah Leary, you've got your hand up again. Do you want to come back in? Presuming, and then ask Mr. Bowl.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And I appreciate your comments, Louise. Thank you very much for that. And I agree with what you said. I think it's just, from my perspective, understanding how the points you've made will be captured within the policy and within the framework of the plan, to ensure that any feedback you're receiving via your monitoring, both of the existing conditions and the mitigated conditions, if you like, taking on board the mitigation that's being delivered, how that is reflected in policy and any requirements that are being made in relation to development schemes for future mitigation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just before I invite Mr. Bull to come in, Mr. Martin Edwards has had his hand up.
Good morning, everyone. And apologies, sir, this might not be the right place to raise this, so I do apologise in advance. But it was just something that had struck us from our readings regarding the actual calculators that we're looking at here. And obviously the difference between Natural England and the Norfolk calculator. I've heard and listened into some of the references, particularly from Natural England in relation to their letter from October of last year. And I didn't know if this was the right point in the session to actually have that discussion about the calculators, or perhaps if that was for a bit later on this morning.
I'm thinking it's within question 18, but Mr. Hatfield, is that something that you intended to cover in relation to question 18?
It's something we can pick up in question 18, yeah. No, that's no problem at all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Bowell.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I welcome Louise Oliver's comments on Natural England. We will be advised of any change in status. What we can do through the local plan is in our monitoring, we will pick up any change in status, but there will be an annual monitoring report which would flag up if the status of the protected habitats has changed. But I welcome the statement from Louise Oliver that we will be informed about any change in status.
Thank you. Can we then, so Mr. Martin Edwards, we will come on to your point later, so please be assured that we're not just deflecting it, but we'll come on to that with question 18. Can we go to look at the next question, please, which is about the viability and the deliverability of residential development as a response to the approach. And I realise that there will be, as I said, a crossover between what we discussed today and what we'll discuss tomorrow when we look at the housing trajectory and the changes, because of consequence changes are resulting from, in some extent, from the nutrient neutrality assumptions. Is the partnership just able to lead off on this and just explain to us what assumptions it has made in relation to the viability of residential development? And I know you've looked at a figure between 5,000 and 7,000 per dwelling, based upon elsewhere and looking at viability work already done and done some updates. And you've made some assumptions on deliverability about particularly when development is likely to start. And we heard a little bit this morning from Mr. Coutier on that. So can I just turn to the partnership and just help us with that, please?
Okay, if I start, and I'll talk about the identification of those costs of 5,000 to 7,000, then I'll ask my colleague Stuart Bisley to talk about the typologies and the approach taken through the updates to the viability study on that, the addendum that's produced. So in terms of those costs, I think Mr. Coutier said earlier that the mitigation to be provided through the Norfolk mitigation strategy is aimed primarily at, is aimed at those developers who cannot provide mitigation themselves. Now, the cost estimates we used, we looked at the experience of other parts of the country. For example, the Solent, they had the announcement on nutrient neutrality was made a number of years before it was in Norfolk. We looked also, probably more importantly, we gained information from our consultants, Royal Haskelley, on the likely mitigation costs of this portfolio of different approaches that could be taken that Mr. Courtier has mentioned already. So this led us to identify 5,000 to 7,000 being an appropriate amount, 7,000 being considered to be quite high. We're confident these are robust. As further evidence emerges, these costs may fall. And I've already mentioned earlier, it's after 2030, after the changes to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill are implemented, these costs should fall significantly, and that's referenced in our evidence. Would you like me to pass you on to Mr. Bisley to talk about typologies?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Following the issue of the letter and the hearing last spring, we were asked to update the original viability work in the context of the impact of nutrient neutrality using the cost range of £5,000 to £7,000, as Mr. Burrell has explained. So those additional costs, both at 5,000 and 7,000, were run through the appraisals and across all typologies. And the addendum 1, which was published in January this year, gives the results of that, and including a summary of the impact of this on all typologies in Appendix B of that addendum 1.
Thank you. And what does it tell us, Mr. Bisley?
It tells us that some typologies the viability is negatively impacted by the cost of the nutrient neutrality mitigation. So typologies 1, 3B, 4A, and 4B, and 7 move from being a positive to a negative viability as a result of the impact of the proposed costs or anticipated costs of the nutrient neutrality mitigation.
And what does that mean?
That means that, in theory, those sites may not be viable, but as the proposed amendments to Policy 5 allows, and in the context of any other significant or material changes, that at an application stage, any site has the opportunity to bring forward a site-specific viability at that particular point through the proposed amendment to Policy 5. So therefore, by implication, potentially allowing for some flex on other policy, delivery of some policies through that viability process.
So it could mean, for example, less contribution for affordable housing.
Correct.
And does the partnership wish to, I mean, I know, Mr. Bisley, you're working with the partnership, but I just wonder whether, in a planning sense, Mr. Bull, whether there's anything you wish to add to what Mr. Bisley said there before we invite other participants to contribute.
Yeah, I think it could, in some cases, lead to the submission of site-specific viability assessments. But as I say, the 5,000 to 7,000 is certainly 7,000, where more typologies affected, is considered to be very much a worst-case scenario, and those costs are likely to fall through this portfolio of measures that's available. So we think we've erred on the side of caution with the 5,000 to 7,000 figures. And some examples that we already have, for example, there's a water efficiency retrofitting scheme that's happening for sites in Norwich, and will be available for the Anglia Square application that's due to be considered in April. And there, the costs are around £3,500 per dwelling, I believe. So that's an example of how the costs can and are very likely to fall. And they will change over time. As this portfolio of measures is developed further, there will be more opportunities, different opportunities for more cost-effective approaches. So the the viability study has to make assumptions, has to reflect a point in time, but these points will change. So we don't anticipate they will have a significant effect on viability, although there is the ability in the proposed amendments to Policy 5 to allow for that to be addressed.
Thank you. And in relation to that water efficiency scheme, the retrofitting scheme, I've seen the report to council you've submitted. That's not affected by the city councils yet to be part of the JVC. It's separate, and I think it would potentially involve for about 1,400 new properties. Effectively, is that right? So you're retrofitting 1,400, and which means that the effect of 1,400 new properties is neutral if that's work's done.
That's correct, and it is anticipated that the retrofitting programme, more work is being done on that, and it may be more properties will be able to benefit from the headroom created by this retrofitting, and the costs, as I say, are falling. So the report that you saw that we've referenced in December, I believe, further work is ongoing, and that is likely to increase the headroom and reduce the costs.
Is that live now? So that if you were dealing with Norwich proposals, you could effectively take a credit because that retro scheme is in operation effectively.
It will be for the Anglia Square, assuming the Anglia Square application is considered in April. This will be part of the package.
Yeah. So effectively, that's where priority is. It's principally trying to enable Anglia Square to come forward.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it illustrates the speed of change, just how much work is going into the portfolio of measures, and things are changing rapidly. Could I ask my colleague Phil Courtier to comment on that a little bit more?
Yes, please. Yes. I know you've got your hand up, Mr. Bonner. I'll come to you in a moment.
Yeah, and just on that specific point, that there's absolute acceptance as part of the partnership that Anglia Square is a key priority for the partnership, and so very content for the City Council to effectively act outside of the joint venture in order to facilitate through their own actions the delivery of Anglia Square. But it doesn't in any way prejudice the forthcoming, joining and then trading through the joint venture in due course. But it is, as you've indicated, a separate point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courtier. Mr. Bonner.
Thank you, sir. I would echo what others have said about support for the partnership in their approach here. I think it's to be commended how quickly they've reacted. We do have concerns though it will affect deliverability for housing, both through delay but also in terms of viability of certain sites. That's and it affects 2/3 of the supply of housing, I think, from the latest evidence. On the viability study, 4 typologies are obviously in deficit, and we don't support the approach that would lead to the reduction of affordable housing, because we've already identified issues in the partnership's ability to deliver the affordable housing requirement as it is. So that would only exacerbate that issue. We query whether the viability work has been based on 2020 costs and assumptions, because if it has, would that lead to a potentially worse outcome for those typologies and potentially others? But I don't know if I've misread the study, but it feels like there's been quite significant inflation in construction costs since 2020. That probably should be accounted for if it hasn't already. So I think our conclusion would be to that clearly the contingency site has a role to play in trying to avoid some of the issues around deliverability, especially before 2030, but also affordable housing provision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonner. Hannah Leary.
Thank you, sir. I would certainly echo what Mr. Bonner has said in relation to concerns around the build costs and increases in build costs. And again, my understanding is that the values that are included within the viability assessment are dated back to 2020, and we're certainly aware that there have been increases in build costs, we believe, in the order of 15 to 20% since that point in time, which is considerable, and particularly when you bear in mind that sales values haven't risen proportionately in relation to build costs as far as we're aware. So that is a big consideration. I mean, I feel comforted by the fact that there are changes proposed to Policy 5 in relation to viability testing and the opportunity for all sites to bring forward viability testing, which reflects the provisions of the NPPF, but also potentially takes on board the considerable additional costs that may be placed upon development sites in relation to the nutrient neutrality mitigation strategy. But I do feel that a potential increase of 15 to 20% in build costs is not insignificant, and that it may be valuable to the partnership to understand quite what impact that may have on deliverability before they proceed too much further, just so there is an understanding of to what degree the additional viability assessments which may come in relation to some of the development sites could have an impact upon deliverability through the plan period. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett.
Good morning. I think I'd first echo the comments that have just been made, but also to sort of agree with previous comments that, again, this is not a situation that we really want to be in, that either we as developers or the council are. We appreciate that it's sort of come halfway through the plan making process. But sort of the facts as we sort of see the moment are that there is the nutrient neutrality, in effect, presents a greater risk to the viability and deliverability of sites across Greater Norwich. And the overall impact will be that less homes are delivered. And that's either because sites become unviable, and they simply don't come forward as shown by the viability assessment. And that's most pertinent for the South Norfolk Village clusters planned sites, which is a typology found to be unviable. I know we're not discussing those sites today because that's a separate plan, but also urban sites in Norwich, and particularly those not captured by the 1400 headroom. Most pertinent of which would be the East Norwich site, which was unviable before, and with the additional costs associated with nutrient neutrality, it adds further weight to that. And there's also a second strand to the fact that we probably will get less homes, is that for those sites that can deliver on-site mitigation, what works do they need to do on site that may affect the capacity to deliver homes? i.e., if you've got to put a wetland in on your site, are you actually able to deliver the full amount of homes that you were once thought you might do? And I think we've just had it confirmed here again, is that we are probably going to get less affordable homes delivered through this plan, as sites that are on marginal viability that do have to deliver on-site mitigation or buy credits, they are going to have to go down the viability routes and deliver less affordable homes. And I think, that's what we will come on to tomorrow in Matter 15, is that we're sort of at the margins here of actually how many homes are going to get delivered in terms of this plan period in relation to need. And with this greater risk, our proposed solution through our Matter statement is that more sites need to be allocated. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, sir. Again, before I start, I'd like to sort of echo other people's thoughts in terms of the work that has been done to date by the authorities. It's clearly a significant challenge, and they're taking it very positive steps towards it. My main concern with the mitigation strategy is the assumption that larger sites will be able to mitigate the impact themselves. We've had reference already to Long Stratton, which was approved at committee, or resolution to grant at committee last week, but hasn't been signed off by Natural England, and could lead to, I think, 600 dwellings being delivered whilst fallowing the rest of the land for 15 years and no more delivery. But I mean, sites like Long Stratton may well be able to deliver on site, but there's kind of a middle ground of sites, and our client's got a site at Smee Lane in just to the east of Norwich for 272 homes, where we submitted a mitigation strategy in October of last year, which includes an on-site package treatment plant, increased surface water treatment drains, you constructed wetland with reactive media to remove phosphorus on site. And that, I mean, that took 3 months for Natural England to come back to us on that, and we're still in the process of responding to their comments. That's a site that at outline stage had a significant area of open space, partly because it's got an orchard on the site that was deemed worthy to protect, and so there is space there to be able to put in more subspacings and more wetland features, but we're still not sure that we'll be able to deliver it. We still haven't reached a point where we can be certain of that. And a lot of other sites are going to be in much worse situations. They won't have the same level of give in terms of on-site open space. It will affect the number of homes that can be delivered on those sites, and it will affect whether they can be delivered viably. So I think some clarity on, you know, what is a large scale site that is expected to deliver nutrient mitigation on the sites is needed, and you know, with that, whether there will be enough mitigation coming forwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gaultier, would you be able to help us with some of those points that have been raised? Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a very pertinent point. In my experience in talking to multiple developers and promoters, generally where a site is 600 and more, but certainly when it's about 1,000 and more, then it can start looking at much more effectively its own solutions. You do have smaller sites. There was one in North Norfolk, I know, outside of this jurisdiction, where it was about 26 homes, and they converted a series of septic tanks that enabled it to progress. So there are smaller scheme solutions as well, but generally where you get 600 to 1,000 and more, you start looking at your own private treatment options on site in a way that perhaps the smaller schemes don't. So that's the sort of threshold. And just to confirm that point, we are having, in addition to Long Stratton, which, as I said, has got a resolution to approve, it's not that, you know, discussions with Natural England have accepted the principle of their proposals. We just need to, or the developer needs to, finalise the details of that, but also positive conversations and engagement with Beeston Park for 3,500 homes. Again, positive conversations around Rackheath for 4,000 homes. Absolutely recognise there'll be other sites that are more constrained and will struggle to excuse the pun, but wash their own faces. But certainly we are confident that circa 60% of the growth that is in this plan could be met by developers providing their own solutions to these schemes.
Thank you. I just want to pick up the point that was raised by Mr. Bonner about the 2020 viability work. I mean, is that is there anything that you want to say in response to that? I mean, it might be Mr. Bisley who might want to respond, but is there anything that you could say in response to that 2020 work and how confident we can be, given the lead in time to prepare viability work, etc.? How confident can we be that that provides a reasonable basis in terms of evidence to look at viability on the effect of nutrient neutrality?
Yes, I mean, the decision was made to leave the original evidence base as it was, as per the original viability work, and because that was obviously considered in some detail and considered last spring when updating. So it was just purely updated based upon the addition of the nutrient neutrality costs. So the original inputs in respect of costs and values for the individual work were not updated as part of that particular process. I mean, there has been comment made that yes, there have been significant increases in costs since 2020, which is true, but also there have been significant increases in values. And if you look at the government statistics on that, they generally talk about 25% increase in all property types since January 2020 to January 2023. So it was decided not to revisit the whole viability case, but just update in the context of the nutrient neutrality costs. And again, position being that over time there are going to be any number of changes to potential inputs. So any site will have the opportunity through the proposed amendment to Policy 5 to bring forward site-specific viability appraisal if required at the application stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bisley. Mr. Tuddenham, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, sir. I think I need to bring in the issue of the Long Stratton consideration in some detail that took place on the 15th, I think it was. Firstly, just to say that on the 15th, there was no response, or the same day a response was received from Natural England, raising a number of pretty complex issues as regards the application, fairly lengthy letter calling upon a number of things. I don't want to bore you with too much detail, but it's a shame that you need really to read the officer's report on the application, which highlights some very significant issues, and one in terms of viability and deliverability. I think this is a straightforward matter that takes into consideration updated viability assessments, because one was done by the council's own third-party experts. I think it's called CP Viability. Yeah, CP Viability looked at the matter in January 2023. And the conclusions reached in that report, and this is the damning bit, is that it will only produce 14% affordable housing, compared with the 33% requirement on 1,800 dwellings. And this is going to be picked up and captured in other viability assessments as the plan moves forward. The other issue that comes up in it is that, and that relates to providing your own answer to nutrient neutrality within a site. The applications sit in the development area of 1,800 dwellings, but because they're having to set land aside for nutrient neutrality, they're only likely to produce 600 dwellings as a consequence of that land having to be held back. And in doing that, I think I'm correct in saying that Natural England has said, of course, the land that's held back has got to be tied up for in perpetuity. So that means the site can only actually develop 600 dwellings out of the 1,800. Complicated, but latest figures that have been coming through, which supports much of what Harry Bennett has said, that sites are just not going to yield. And if they do yield, they're going to yield levels of affordable housing about a third of what this authority is, or what the Greater Norwich Development Partnership are looking for. And of course, there is no mechanism at policy level to correct this situation, because if you haven't got a site, if a site is not allocated, the affordable housing simply won't take place, and then planning authorities will turn around and refuse on the basis of policy. And I had that particular matter occur, I think, about 18 months ago in an appeal matter where the inspector basically turned around and said we were going for a high level of affordable housing, threw the thing out because it wasn't within a policy area or an allocated site. And this is going to fall through all the way down the line until solutions are found. And like a number of people have said, I have sympathy on the authorities here. This has been sprung on them very late in the day. It is complex, but the truth of the matter is that it's not going to yield and is unlikely to yield for some considerable time. The other simplification may well be that developers, together with those sites that are allocated for development, may wait till like 2030 for matters to be resolved. Well, that's fine, but that doesn't produce the houses in the meantime. And then finally, in the interim, it's a small number of purchasers of properties that are going to bear the burden of this problem, whereas it's actually the current population and the past population who've created that problem. But they're expecting newcomers and new buyers to rectify that. I would suggest, if I may, sir, that the need exists to look at these two applications in Long Stratton to get the gist of the actual true current position. And the application numbers are South Norfolk 2018/0111 and 2018/0112. Still outline applications. Thank you.
Thank you. Long Stratton is not an allocation in this plan, so whilst I can understand why you're making reference to it, because it's part of the housing commitment, but it's not an allocation.
I recognise that. It's a misuse of a word. I do apologise. It's a commitment, and it's a commitment that is not yielding. Simple as that.
Well, we will look at situation on commitments tomorrow. But I wonder whether this partnership wishes to say anything in response to the point that Mr. Tunham's made.
Thank you. I mean, I think you've made an important point already. From my perspective, I am absolutely far more optimistic than Mr. Tuddenham, and I remain confident that there is a strategic solution to nutrient neutrality at Long Stratton, which is why South Norfolk was prepared to take it through to its Development Management Committee with that resolution to approve. Nor do I envisage that is now going to be months and months in the waiting until that strategy is finalised. There have been previous conversations prior to Norfolk Homes, Norfolk Land submitting that strategy. There were pre-submission conversations with Natural England where there was an acceptance of what their strategy was entailing. And as I say, I remain optimistic that that can be finalised and progressed.
Thank you. On deliverability, you just check the assumptions that you've made in relation to extended lead-in times, effectively. To what extent? How have you arrived at that? And the work that you described, Mr. Coutier, early on today, about things being in place and evolving and different kind of options and ways of dealing with things evolving. How is that work which is picked up likely to affect the start and lead-in times for the sites? And does it mean that, for example, the work where you are now presents I suppose a better platform than where you were 6 months ago for pre-application discussions and work in preparation for sites, which might mean that the delays, I'm putting, maybe saying this, but I'm saying it in a way, but the delays might not be as as long as perhaps originally envisaged. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back even 6 months, then, you know, and I genuinely, I am grateful for the comments that you are hearing from other people in this examination, that I would argue that there is no other area in this country that has moved as quickly with the scale of proposal as this area, including the Greater Norwich Partnership. And so, yes, we are in a much better position than we were 6 months ago. Are we absolutely over the line? No, there is still a huge amount of work to be done, and you're hearing that already. In terms of how quickly that lead-in period is, there are, I'm afraid, a number of known unknowns. And I've always said from day one, the moment the JV goes live, there will be a taper that, you know, initially there will be a relatively small number of credits available in the first couple of months. I would like to think that we would have credits equivalent to a couple of 100 homes, 300 homes in the first couple of months. But then we can taper very quickly, making certain reasonable assumptions. And it's one of the reasons why we are in such an advantageous position with our joint venture is Anglian Water's partnership in that, and that they can carry out fairly significant works which have a profound impact in terms of mitigating and offsetting the amount of P and N, phosphate and nitrate kilograms. But in addition to that, we have other things that we are progressing at pace. For example, septic tank conversion. You convert one septic tank, you can generally get away 10 new dwellings. So a significant ratio. The conversion of a septic tank, let's say, is about £10,000 plus some additional costs associated with that. Within our catchment, we estimate there's about 3,500 septic tanks. So even if you increase that by tenfold, that's 35,000 new homes if you converted all those septic tanks. We're not going to do that, but I'm simply illustrating the scale, how quickly we can scale this up with the trading platform that we are creating. We are having those relevant conversations, whether it's with Anglian Water, with landowners that have septic tanks, with companies and registered providers that can retrofit their existing housing stock in the same way as Norwich City are retrofitting their housing stock. It's a long-winded way of saying we see this tapering significantly. The critical question is, how quickly can we do that? It is absolutely my role, our role, that we are dedicated to making sure that we expedite those that provision as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coulter. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, sir. Just a point on the working with Anglian Water to improve their sewage treatment works. I thought I might just read a section from Natural England's response to the Long Stratton application, which says Solution 2 relies on Anglian Water upgrading Long Stratton Water Recycling Centre to offset the remaining nutrient load. Natural England does not currently consider this acceptable mitigation. Currently, there is not a mechanism to enable developers to make contributions to water companies to bring forward additional improvements to wastewater treatment works. Even if there was such a mechanism, then these improvements are likely to be required to enable designated sites recovery, and therefore they cannot be double counted or traded to facilitate development, as this will undermine and or hinder restoration of the designated site. Therefore, further mitigation measures should be considered. I think it's probably worth getting Natural England's view on that as whether that works or not.
Mr. Coulter, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's a good point. One, there's a number of points that I'd like to make. I don't fully, at this point in time, agree with that stance. There are a number of factors to take into account. The first is that we have to have regard to TAL, and under the Levelling Up Bill, then there is a proposal for those wastewater recycling centres that serve a population of 2,000 or more to be upgraded by or improve capacity by 2030. It's important to note that doesn't strip out all phosphates and nitrates. It simply increases the capacity to strip out more. So it doesn't solve the problem entirely. It's also worth noting that there's 88 wastewater recycling centres across the catchment. Again, that's outside, they're not obviously all within the Greater Norwich area, but clearly, even if they're outside the catchment, they can have a profound impact upon nutrients within the Greater Norwich area. So that's why I'll refer to the entire catchment. So there's 88 wastewater recycling centres across the entire catchment. Only 15 of those serve a population of 2,000 or more. So we recognise that if those are being upgraded already under the Levelling Up Bill, that we can't then double count them, but you can bring enhancements in advance of 2030, which we understand you can allow that provision. Effectively, if you upgrade in 2025, you bring forward those enhancements, we would argue that you can capture 5 years worth of that improved stripping out of phosphates and nitrates. But we also recognise that there are many other wastewater recycling centres that are not working at capacity in terms of stripping out phosphates and nitrates. In fact, the vast majority of catchment are not going to benefit from the enhancements on TAL, and therefore we do, as we understand it, in accordance with Anglian Water's restrictions having regard to Ofwat, you can make enhancements to those wastewater recycling centres and direct effectively credits and income from credits at those enhancements. Excuse me. Does that make sense? Do I need to provide any further clarification on that point?
No, thank you, Mr. Courtier. And also, I've got the Anglian Water, the information from Anglian Water in the statement, which is on page 17 of the partnership statement in relation to Anglian Water's position. So I'm not intending to go and invite Anglian Water to make further responses. I understand the point Mr. Jones has made, and I take your response, and I've also got what they have set out in writing to us. Okay, thank you. Are there any other points? And we will come on to look at tomorrow. We're coming in to look at housing trajectory, and we're looking at some of the commitments in detail. I'm also looking at some of the changes to the housing trajectory, which, as I say, result in part from nutrient neutrality. But are there any other points that have not been made that people wish to make now before we move off question 17? Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for your contributions. I think it's a good time to take a break. So if we take a break till 11:30, Mr. Hatfield, you're going to come in?
Just a quick point on the length of the break. I've been listening to the discussion, and a number of the points that have been raised and made by participants perhaps stray into questions I was going to answer. So I was going to ask under question 18. So I was wondering if we could have a half an hour break just to allow me to reformulate some of my questions based on what I've heard. That'd be helpful for me before we return. I'd be more than confident of getting concluded by lunchtime as well.
Okay, that sounds sensible, if it helps us. So it's now nearly 15:15. So shall we resume at 11:45? Okay. Okay, we'll break and resume at 11:45. Thank you.
The hearing sessions are resumed. It's a relief everyone's here. Apologies for that. It appeared on my screen as if it was just me, Mr. Burrell and Ms. Feeney. So it's a relief that everyone is here, all present and correct. Okay, we'll move now on to question 18, which is the neutrality mitigation strategy likely to be successful in facilitating the delivery of the plan? A few points of clarification just to start the discussion. Question for the partnership first, please. The nutrient strategy by Royal Haskinen, which is document G2.2, is labelled as being draft from page 6 onwards. And the examination library also states that it will be updated in the coming weeks. So with that in mind, what's the current status of that document and what further updates is it intended to apply to it? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The draft document will be updated soon. The final, what we're calling the final study, the final Norfolk mitigation strategy, that is being considered by the steering group tomorrow. Then, dependent on finalising it, it should be available in the over the next month. So that will be the final strategy, and it includes, as flagged up previously, more information about long-term mitigation measures and some further clarifications as flagged up on our website.
Okay, so the version that's currently before the examination is in effect a partial version of the full study relating to short-term measures, and that'll be subject to minor updates and with additions relating to the medium and longer term ones.
Yeah, I emphasise that it's not they aren't significant updates, and they do relate largely to long-term mitigation.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. I mean, that was my next question. It was the progress on the second element of the report, the medium to longer term. If that's going to the steering group tomorrow, presumably that's at an advanced stage, is it, Mr. Burrell?
Yes, the steering group is considering the final draft of that document. So clearly there could be some changes as a result of discussions at the steering group. But yes, we have received a final document.
And when do you anticipate the final document being published?
I don't think I can put a specific date on it, but I'd be confident it would be within the next 2 or 3 weeks. Mr. Courtier, is there anything you would like to add on that?
No, I think that's a reasonable assumption as it stands at the moment. The other point I'd make, and my apologies if I'm going slightly at a tangent, it's important to recognise, sorry, Mike Burrell, you on mute. The other important point to note is that this hasn't been a sequential exercise where we've waited for that report before we then act on the mitigation measures and its findings. It's a strategy that sets out what those mitigation measures are, but as that report has been progressed and we have seen various drafts, then we have started pursuing a number of those mitigation measures in parallel rather than waiting until it's published. So yes, it's important that it's published. Yes, it's important that other people can see the work that we are looking to pursue and how that is informing the actions of the joint venture. But it has not been waiting for that to be published and then we'll do something else. It's very much been a parallel process.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Courtier. A number of measures highlighted in the Royal Haskinen report that have been published so far would need to be installed on farms, such as riparian buffer strips, silt traps, and other measures would require changes to farming management, such as reductions or cessation, I should say, of fertiliser and manure application. So how would the cooperation of farmers or the buy-in of farmers be secured to deliver those? Thank you.
Yeah, so again, what we've tried, because as I described earlier, the purpose of the joint venture is not to have multiple bespoke conversations with lots of individuals, but instead it's looking at working on much more of a wholesale strategic layer. And so the conversations have been with cooperatives of farming groups and membership groups. So FWAG, which is the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group for Norfolk, has in excess of 300 members and covers a large swathe of Norfolk. And so conversations have happened with those sorts of groups. Let me just give you one example. FWAG has agreed to help implement the County Council's objective of planting 1 million trees across Norfolk. So what we can do is piggyback on that initiative that is being exercised by FWAG, implemented by FWAG, and direct them at planting those trees as riparian buffers rather than as in more ad hoc locations. So we're not reinventing the wheel, we're simply harnessing work that is already going on with large-scale membership groups, with the agricultural sector who's already made a commitment to tree planting, but then use that as riparian buffers. In a similar way, we're engaged with organisations such as Wensum Farmers, who represent, I think from recollection, 24 farmers covering huge hectarage of land along the Wensum, and they are a legal entity, so actually we can enter into agreements with them as a legal entity representing 28 farms and farmers. And again, we are initiating conversations, for example, with regard to cover crops or other mitigation measures. So that's the approach that we're taking to the agricultural sector, looking at wholesale, large-scale mitigation measures. And that also means that we're not pinning all our hopes on one parcel of land or one farmer. Excuse me. I've got a cough, which is why I keep sort of swallowing my words, but my apologies.
It's okay.
Does that make sense, and does that help, or do you need any further clarification on that?
Well, it's helpful. How many farmers would need to be on board in order to deliver significant numbers of nutrient credits? Because obviously riparian buffers, as I understand them, are on the periphery of fields. Obviously each farm will have so many fields. Similarly, silt traps, again, they need to be installed on land. How many farmers would you, or how many landowners would need to be buying into this, in your opinion, to deliver significant numbers of credits?
Can I step back from that question? Not because I'm trying to avoid it, but I want to put it in context, if that's okay. So from day one, we've always said, as a joint venture and as a partnership of local authorities and Anglian Water, that the best way that we will mitigate against nutrient neutrality is to take a portfolio approach to mitigation. And that's not, therefore, relying upon one area. So there's 4 key areas that we will be dealing with. The first will be working on land with land usage, and that will include things like riparian buffers, silt traps, cover crops as a temporary bridging form of mitigation. But it will also include, as a second area, nature-based solutions, so your sort of wetlands and reed beds to help absorb phosphates and nitrates. The third area would be retrofitting of housing stock, as you'll be familiar with from other areas in the country, but also Norwich City's proposals that we have at the moment, but rolling that out to registered providers and other large-scale businesses that have a large number of homes. And then the fourth is water infrastructure, which is where Anglian Water come in, and where you can also include septic tank conversion. So those 4 areas provide a palette, a portfolio of in excess of 20 different projects and ways you can mitigate. Now, best case scenario, we can get big bang for our buck by working with Anglian Water to secure large-scale mitigation projects that mitigate large-scale. Sorry, go on. You want to come in?
So just to stop you there, I appreciate the approach, the portfolio of measures. That's come through loud and clear in the statements. I think the approach I wanted to take is to disaggregate that and look at each one of those elements in turn. So I'll come on to retrofitting. I'll come on to Anglian Water as infrastructure, but I did want to deal with farming in the first instance.
Okay, my apologies. My apologies. The reason why it was important for that context to be given was I would argue that cover crops, because of their temporary nature, are easy wins, but are temporary, and therefore over an 80-year period become exceptionally expensive. So I actually would prefer not to be relying upon cover crops. I see cover crops as a temporary buffer that you can allow yourself to use as a buffer on an annual basis. Riparian buffer strips, you may invite Natural England to comment in due course. There is, at this point in time, a lack of hard and fast evidence around riparian buffer strips in terms of how much mitigation you can secure and how quickly you can rely upon that mitigation. So I suppose where I'm coming to is my preference would be, I think there are other quick wins and more robust mitigation solutions, but I would see if we can work with the agricultural sector and still provide additional offsetting through it, then that will be a bonus, but I don't see that as the core of the mitigation strategy. Okay. So again, I haven't given you a hectareage, because if in reality we can secure the vast majority, if not all of the mitigation from those other areas and those other mitigation strategies, then actually we may not need a huge amount of hectareage. And I certainly have concerns if we then start talking about challenges around food security and other large land take for nutrient neutrality. The final point I would make is I do actually see, as we move into potential stacking with biodiversity net gain, and Norfolk environmental credits will be established to enable it not only to trade in nutrient neutrality, but also biodiversity net gain and other environmental credit-based systems. Actually, it may become an even more attractive proposition for farmers, because they could double stack the credits for things such as riparian buffers.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you made a point there about relying on riparian buffer strips. Is that presumably because the vegetation takes time to establish and mature and deliver the benefits?
Yes, in effect, absolutely.
I think one of the other measures mentioned in the nutrient strategy was it willow cropping or willow copsing? Presumably a similar consideration would apply there. There's a lead-in time for the plants to establish themselves such that the mitigation is secured.
Absolutely.
And so am I right in thinking that there was a more medium term rather than short term in that respect?
Yeah, you'll be bored of the word portfolio by the time we've finished this session, but I think it's important to recognise that layering. And absolutely, I come back to, they are part of that portfolio, but there's, at this point in time, as of today, the urgency is to get quick solutions and as robust solutions as possible, so that we can be trading credits as quickly as possible. So I'm going to go to conversion of a septic tank. You can quite scientifically and robustly estimate, calculate the level of mitigation you can achieve from converting a septic tank to a private packaged treatment plant. And you can effectively secure that in a very short time frame, because once you've converted it, you can be counting that mitigation. So it's much more scientifically based, much more evidence based, and can be achieved quickly. So those are the sorts of solutions that here and now, whilst we're trying to get this growth going again at pace, those are the sorts of things we're exploring and focusing upon. That's not to say, as I've already said, we're having those other conversations with large scale farming cooperatives and membership groups. But our focus at the moment is what can we deliver quickly? What can we deliver robustly? What can give us biggest bang for our buck? And in due course, especially when we can start stacking things such as biodiversity net gain, I am absolutely convinced that we'll see those other solutions surrounding the agricultural sector coming to the fore more and more.
And as things stand today, are any farmers or landowners signed up to provide any nutrient credits through farming practices or through land management? Are there any landowners or farm owners who are currently signed up to provide that?
We haven't got anyone that is formally and legally signed up, but we are having conversations with 2 cooperatives, for want of a better word, organisations representing quite large scale land interests, which is leading towards a legal agreement in due course.
Okay, thank you. So we catch up on my notes. If I look this way, it's because I'm scribbling. So
it's fine. It's
I'm not trying to give you a side profile to admire.
No, but if you start yawning, then I know that you're a bit bored.
In relation to upgrades to water treatment works, how realistic is it to bring forward these proposed upgrades, and how quickly can those upgrades be implemented?
Yeah, again, good question. I'm going to divide that into two areas. Well, I'm going to divide it into multiple areas because it depends on the nature and the type of the wastewater recycling centres. So if we recognise, as I said earlier, that 15 of the 88 wastewater recycling centres across the catchment are likely to be subject to TAL, there's the first question, which is, can Anglia Water secure money to bring forward those enhancements and recapture the mitigation in between the period at which those enhancements come into effect and 2030? So that's the first question. The likelihood of that happening, I know that Anglia Water are in conversation with Ofwat and others to secure money to bring forward enhancements to at least 3 or 4 of those large major wastewater recycling centres. We then have the proposal that we could direct funding at some of those remaining wastewater recycling centres that are not subject to TAL and where we could actually achieve quite significant enhancements. Now, we estimate, ballpark figure, that those enhancements would be circa £1 million. And you could do that via a variety of means. You can add on some additional technology and hard infrastructure that provides further phosphate stripping. Or you could suggest that they acquire land and seek a nature-based solution at the outfall of those wastewater recycling centres. One will obviously be pretty immediate and one would have a longer lead-in time. But you're still looking at about the same sort of cost. But again, because actually you can target those wastewater recycling centres that are effectively at the head of the river, then you can have an impact, a wider impact upon a much larger area of the catchment. As I say, if, and I'm going to go back to the point that I made earlier, in the budget where the Chancellor has clearly, well, has established through that budget a local credit allocation scheme, we think there will be multiple millions of pounds in that scheme. I'll say it again, we are very much at the vanguard of this work. I was in number 10 to discuss this sort of thing literally about 4 weeks ago. So we are in dialogue with government about this. So we think we will have access to additional funding. And there's nothing to then stop us directing that money at enhancements to some of those wastewater recycling centres that will not be subject to TAL. And we could say make significant enhancements and mitigation as a result.
And what are the lead-in times for those upgrades to wastewater treatment works? How far into the future is it before they will be delivering nutrient credits that can then be sold to developers?
Yeah. So again, it does depend on what option you go for. You can put on effectively infrastructure to allow for greater phosphate stripping. You can use chemicals that then dosing to strip out phosphates and nitrates. So you can act quickly and have, I'm going to use the word, immediate impact. Now, if you need a little bit of kit on the end of that, on the end of the wastewater recycling centre, you're likely to need planning permission. So you've got a couple of months lead in. Yeah, there's going to be some further feasibility work, but we're working very closely with a team at Anglia Water to look at these options and what is, so that work is already commencing to look at which wastewater recycling centres should we be targeting and what's the best solution for those. But in a fairly short space of time, we can be using the credits arising from that mitigation. If there is a more hybrid version and you could use nature-based solutions at the outfall of 2 or 3 of those wastewater recycling centres, then it may well be there's a longer lead-in time for that to be counted as mitigation. However, and I'm going to give Natural England credit here, Natural England are relying upon a nature-based solution approach, adopting that in the Tees at the moment. They're looking at options in Norfolk at the moment, albeit not implemented or at a stage to implement at the moment. But for nature-based solutions, they're taking a 3-stage approach that effectively, when you secure the land and you've done your initial feasibility work, then they're likely to offer credits at that stage, albeit limited amount, and perhaps underwriting that with cover crops, but they're not waiting till the full implementation of that nature-based solution. And then at the implementation of that nature-based solution, there'll be another tranche of credits available, and then perhaps a couple of years down the line, the wetland may be outperforming where it was envisaged, and you could sell another tranche of credits. What I'm trying to illustrate through that is that even with a nature-based solution, Natural England, I think, are looking to issue credits at an early stage in order to enable growth to get going on the basis that that wetland will be delivered.
But with regards to wastewater treatment works upgrades, that's hard infrastructure, as opposed to wetland introductions or woodland introductions, which obviously have the need time to establish, as we've already discussed. So presumably there are milestones that need to be hit for those upgrades to be in place. I mean, I think it'd be helpful for me to understand in slightly firmer terms what those milestones are and roughly when you anticipate those credits being available and to be online for a timescale in terms of between. I appreciate it might be an estimate, and you can provide me with the reasoning for that estimate, but I think something that's a bit firm would be helpful to me. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine. Are you happy for that to be forwarded post-examination? The reason I'm saying is we're meeting, I mean, this week we're meeting with Angling Water, twice this week, met with them on Monday. We've got another meeting. One of my colleagues is meeting with them to literally be thrashing out the prioritization of projects and how they'll be delivered and when they'll be delivered. So it's an evolving, ongoing piece of work. I can give you some very rough estimates sort of off the top of my head at this point in time, but it would be probably more robust if we followed this up post this day.
Is that something you're intending to incorporate into the updated report, the Royal Haskinning report? I'm just aware that that's been published in a few weeks anyway, so rather than duplicate work.
Absolutely. The Royal Haskinning work clearly does talk about these solutions, but it doesn't set out. No, it's not something that's going to be enshrined in that document. It's simply setting out that palette of options that we've got available, and then the joint venture is progressing the delivery and implementation of that palette of options. So it won't be enshrined in the Royal Haskinning report.
I'll reflect on that point. I'll have a discussion perhaps with Mr. Warden in the lunch break.
Absolutely.
I appreciate the offer. Thank you for that. And if you are in a situation where there are a lot of moving parts and you're subject to discussions in the next week or so, I appreciate it might be difficult to give a firm timescale now. We'll come back to you on that point if that's okay. But thank you for the offer.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. And in terms of that portfolio of measures you discussed before, what proportion of that portfolio do you envisage that wastewater treatment works would encompass? You mentioned, for example, that farming issues might not be needed at all. For that to be the case, presumably you're anticipating that certain other areas will deliver more credits than others. Where do wastewater treatment work upgrades factor in that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, this is ballpark, so forgive me, but in my mind, we'd be looking at somewhere in the region of in excess of 50% coming through wastewater recycling or water infrastructure enhancements. If I include septic tank conversion within that as well, I'd be taking that up perhaps even closer to 70% perhaps. And then retrofitting, probably somewhere in the region of about 10%, and then the remaining options, including nature-based solutions and agricultural interventions, would be for the remainder.
Okay, that's helpful. So wastewater upgrades are in effect the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak.
Including, so wait, if I capture water infrastructure as a category, say up to about 70%, absolute biggest bang for our buck. but that is not entirely reliant upon angling water because, as I've said earlier, septic tank conversion gives you an incredible ratio. We've got a huge number of septic tanks. Again, I think I said earlier, we estimate there's in excess of 3,000 septic tanks even within our catchment. If you, even at pre-TAL ratio levels, if you have a conversion rate of 10 new dwellings for every septic tank you convert, then that's 30,000 new dwellings you could secure, even if you just relied upon septic tank conversion. Now, we're not going to convert all of those septic tanks, but it gives you an understanding of the scale at which we can achieve through this joint venture, relying, yes, upon angling water, but also engaging with large-scale landowners. Another thing with Norfolk is there are a number of landowners where they have large number of properties served by septic tanks. So again, you can do wholesale mitigation rather than doing lots of deals with lots of individuals.
Okay, Mr. Bennett, you've got your hand raised. Do you wish to come in?
Yeah, it was just a quick one on the sort of percentage in terms of the credits and about the wastewater treatment works. If they're accounting for, again, I know it's a circa figure, sort of 50%. In reality, does that mean we're not, as sort of developers, going to be able to access credits for 50% of the credits until 2030? So if that is the case, then we're looking at it may not be, which is a question coming back to it, but if that is the case, that obviously has implications for the sort of viability and deliverability that we were talking about in question 17. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Did you wish to respond to that point, Mr. Courtier? Have I frozen? I see a couple of people on the screen have frozen. Is it me or is it people freezing?
It's not you, Mr. Hatfield.
It's not me.
It's not you.
It was Mr. Howell Williams and Mr. Courtier who froze for me. Mr. Burrell remained animated. It's the Mr. Courtier still appears to be frozen to me. Mr. Howell Williams is back. I'm going to suggest, Mr. Courtier, if you can hear me and you're having persistent issues, it's the classic thing with any technology: log out and log back in again, and that tends to resolve it 9 times out of 10. Mr. Burrell, did you wish to?
Mr. Courtier will come to my screen, which appears to be working, as I say, and answer the point.
We're in the fortunate position, Mr. Courtier. We have a still image of you and you as well on the screen. So.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Just a detailed point. If Mr. Burrell could perhaps close the camera on your other computer, just so we have one version of you rather than two.
You don't want two of me? I can't believe it. Do you want to close my camera?
We want to get one of each, I'm afraid, Mr. I always called you Mr. Burrell because of the notation, Mr. Courtier. I apologise.
No, it's not a problem.
Okay,
so I think the question was, well, if we're relying upon angling water so heavily, do we therefore developers have to wait until 2030? My apologies, that's not the point I meant to make at all. In actual fact, relying upon angling water means that we can expedite mitigation as quickly as possible. The only reason why 2030 is relevant is because TAL comes in and actually reduces that burden for those 15 wastewater recycling centres that I've referred to, which I, again, repeat, will be the minority of wastewater recycling centres in the catchment. It wasn't my intention to imply that the angling water improvements would wait until post 2030. We would expedite those and are in discussions with angling water to expedite them.
Right. And that process, I think it was mentioned in your hearing statement, or it might have been in one of the evidence documents, G1.2.1 or 2.2, is that, in your opinion, bringing forward some of those planned upgrades gives you the extra years was one thing, one element of the scheme, and was the other that you could upgrade the other smaller wastewater treatment works, and that provides an additional benefit over and above the measures that will come in 2030 in any event. Is that correct understanding?
Yes, absolutely. And within this, it's important to recognise that clearly under the habitats regulations, we should be mitigating for 80 years in perpetuity, recognising that's about 80 years. But in the same way as cover crops work, they provide effectively a bridge to get to more permanent solutions. So in Wiltshire, for example, and a scheme agreed with Natural England, then that is reliant upon using cover crops as a bridge to get to a yet unknown permanent solution. So there's a recognition that even if some of the angling and water key infrastructure was delivered earlier than 2030 due to the ability to bring it under the joint venture, then that will provide a bridge to more permanent solutions. Do you see what I mean? It's effectively acting as bridging mitigation. As I say, that's a model that's been used and adopted in Wiltshire and accepted by Natural England in terms of providing that bridging to a more permanent solution.
Okay, thank you. There's been a couple of references made to the number of septic tanks and the potential that each of those can secure an offset that could release dwellings. You mentioned before that septic tanks aren't necessarily owned by individuals, but can be owned on estates. I think was that the point you made?
Yes, it was.
So is there then a method of reaching a large number of septic tanks efficiently through that route? It wasn't clear from what you said before whether that's what you were implying. It'd be helpful to hear elaboration on that point if that was what you were saying. Yeah,
absolutely. So even now we're in discussion with one estate as a precursor to a follow-up conversation with another estate. The first one has about 30 septic tanks within its responsibility. The second has circa 100 septic tanks within its responsibility. And we would look to do deals with that estate to convert the septic tanks which are under their responsibility. So again, you're effectively doing one legal agreement, but for that you are, for the first estate, mitigating, let's say, 300 homes, for the second estate, perhaps 1,000 homes. And there are a number of estates across the catchment that will effectively impact upon the Greater Norwich area that we would be looking to do deals with. There is even another conversation that we're having, recognising that some villages are served, the majority of properties within that village are served by septic tanks. Now, it's very early days, so I'm not going to rely upon this heavily, but I think there's absolutely a concept where you could set up a umbrella community organisation that effectively takes some responsibility for the conversion of those septic tanks in those areas. Or you could have a commercial enterprise that effectively signs up X number of properties in any one village to convert septic tanks into private package treatment plants. So there are multiple avenues, and in the nicest possible way, this is in my mind, a rich vein of mitigation, and we'll continue to pursue it.
When you say estates, are those estates of social housing, or are they traditional
traditional landed estates?
Traditional landed estates with large numbers of properties attached to them.
Yeah,
and the septic
absolutely.
tanks are managed centrally by that estate.
And that each property would be owned by that estate, and its maintenance would be the responsibility of that estate.
Okay.
Another simple example is, a large number of properties within this area are the responsibility owned by National Trust. Is just one other example. So those are the sorts of conversations that we are having, targeting those areas where they have responsibility for multiple properties served by septic tanks.
And what are the lead-in times for replacing septic tanks with those package treatment works? How long would it take to secure that? Say, for argument's sake, you reached an agreement with the estate that had 100 dwellings. How long would it take to replace those 100 septic tanks and convert them?
Yeah, let me take a step back. There would be a degree to which, in order for the joint venture to buy the mitigation arising from that septic tank conversion, there is clearly work to be done in order to evidence the level of mitigation that will be secured. So there needs to be some work and some evidence in order to satisfy ultimately the habitats regulations and make sure that joint venture is robustly selling credits. So there's a lead-in piece of work, but there is that's not reinventing the wheel. That we've already seen feasibility work along those lines, but you'd assume a few weeks for that. Then apart from that, you don't need a license, you don't need planning permission. As long as it's for a single private package treatment plant, it would be when that plant is available and when the work can be done. I'd also argue that, and again, these are conversations to be had with Natural England, and I don't want to preempt where those would go. I would be arguing in the case where the funding has been secured, where there's a legal agreement which requires the landowner to convert, let's say, 50 septic tanks over the next 18 months, then you can start selling credits on the basis that that has been secured, and on the basis that there's generally post-planning permission, a year to 18 months lead-in period before occupation. So there's a degree to which that conversation will need to be had with Natural England through the credit allocation and then ultimately through the planning process. But I think once you have a legal agreement which requires that landowner to deliver that septic tank conversion, perhaps over the next 12 months, taking into account the scale of some of that work, that we could start relying upon that for the release of some credits.
Okay, just one final question from me before I bring in Ms. Leary, whose hand's raised. What's in it for the landowners of these estates? Why would they volunteer to convert septic tanks? What's in it for them?
Yeah, a number of factors. I mean, ultimately, they don't have to. But I think most landowners, especially those organisations such as the National Trust, will recognise the impact that septic tanks do have upon the environment. They are a major contributor to the excess nutrients and turning our watercourses into the watercourses we want and turning them into adverse conditions. So there is a environmental moral issue there. The second point is
just on that point then, are you relying on the landowners being environmentally conscious in effect?
No, I mean, in addition, if someone was coming to you and saying you have a substandard septic tank and we are effectively offering to pay for that to be converted to a private package treatment plant with perhaps even a small supplement to that to allow for future maintenance, then I'm not yet convinced why I'd be saying, no, that's a really bad idea, I don't want that to happen. But I'm still going to go back to the sorts of figures I described earlier. If we're talking in excess of 3,000 septic tanks in our catchment, even if we delivered 10% of that, that's still 3,000 homes that we're mitigating. Even if we delivered 20%, that's still 6,000 homes that we're mitigating. These are large figures simply because of the scale of the number of septic tanks that are in our catchment at this point in time. So we're not looking to rely on this 100%. I think we're being conservative in the estimates with regard to how many we would like to see converted. But I think as the environment, as water quality is going up and up people's agendas, I mean, you say, are we solely relying upon the environmental sort of credentials of landowners? I wouldn't underestimate how important that is in some people's minds more and more, especially if we can do those enhancements without imposing any additional cost on them.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Leary, you've been very patient. Did you wish to come in?
Yes, thank you, sir. Sorry, just my hand. Mr. Courtier may actually have already addressed the point I was going to raise, but I'm aware that out there within the market, some landowners or some developers and also some RSLs are already approaching estates and leafleting in villages and such like to try and develop exactly what you've been talking about, a scenario in which they replace those existing tanks. Are you, as a partnership, therefore looking to take the lead on that, or how are you accounting for the fact that's already potentially happening within the market? Sorry, Mr. Courtier, before you carry on, I had a second point which probably moves us on a little bit from where we are, but I'm interested to understand how the partnership are going to start to look at prioritising some of these credits in terms of a hierarchy, effectively, of how you identify who gets priority on those new credits, whether it's local plan allocations first, whether it's sites which already have existing approval. So, any information you have on how that might be looking, I know you're developing that at the moment, would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Leary. And just a procedural point, but all questions to come through me, thank you, rather than directly to other participants. Mr. Courtier, that's okay. It's okay. Mr. Courtier, do you wish to respond to those 2 points? Thank you.
Yeah, there's always a danger when you give me 2 points, because I generally can only remember one at a time, but I'll do my best. The first point was, well, what about other developers for filling this space? Look, if the joint venture, if the market is performing so effectively that the joint venture doesn't need to operate, that will be a happy day for me. This is taking the majority of my time, and there's plenty of other things that I need to be concentrating on as well. So this isn't that the joint venture is seeing this as a market that we're going to absolutely compete in. And look, if other people can find their own solutions, if Natural England can come in with a credit-based system, if other organisations come in with credit allocation schemes, brilliant. Because my main aim is to ensure that we deliver a sustainable growth agenda within this district to provide the homes that we need, whilst protecting the environment and enabling the economy to function. So I don't see this as competitive. If you come up with a land deal to mitigate your development, brilliant. But at this point in time, and it's not criticism, the market has been unable to intervene and expedite the delivery of any sort of credit-based system or mitigation to enable housing to go. So therefore, we felt that we were absolutely duty-bound to step into that space and enable a trading mechanism. But as I say, if we are no longer trading in 5 years' time because other people have filled that space, brilliant. Having made the joke about it, I have now forgotten your second point. I'm sorry. How do we prioritize
of
yes,
credits.
Thank you very much. So it's a really important point, and it's one that we are absolutely discussing that through the partners of the joint venture in terms of that credit allocation. The first criteria for allocation of those credits is a very binary thing, and it's enshrined within the habitats regulations, and that is you need the mitigation and the source of new nutrients to be geographically related. So if we've secured mitigation in the Wensum, we're not going to be allocating those credits in the Bure because they're not geographically related, and therefore they wouldn't be compliant with the habitats regulation. So the first point is there has to be a geographical connectivity between mitigation and the source. The next point would be, and this is where we will be thrashing this out, but it's coming back to the point I made earlier, is that the larger schemes will be able to, in many cases, find mitigation for themselves. And so therefore there is a prioritization towards those schemes that can't, which will probably be much more the SMEs. So that will be a key factor. The other factor will to make sure that there is a proportionate spread of the allocation across the partners. There's no point in acting as a partnership and then Breckland or South Norfolk take all, or Norwich or Broadland take all that mitigation, all the allocations themselves, and just so there would be a recognition of some degree of proportionate spread across the catchment. But I come back to saying that is still absolutely under discussion, and that prioritisation will become more evident, and we'll be transparent about that as we work that through. But I'm going to reiterate, I'm going to reiterate, in the early days, I think the key criteria will be that geographical location until we taper up to larger scales of credits.
Okay, just before I allow to come back, Ms. Leary, I just wanted to make a quick timetabling point. I'm aware, Ms. Leary, you need to be away by 1. And in an ideal world, I'd like to conclude the session before lunch. So I think with that in mind, if people could keep answers focused and on the question I ask, and we'll move through it quickly with that point in mind. So Ms. Leary, do you wish to come back on the points that have been raised there by Mr. Courtier?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, just I suppose, Mr. Courtier, I was just looking to get some reassurance from Mr. Courtier as to where the existing allocations or allocations that have been carried forward into the new plan will sit in relation to that hierarchy, bearing in mind what we're talking about in terms of the content of the plan itself.
Yes, okay. again, quick response, one of the criteria will absolutely be, is a scheme deliverable early? So there's no point in issuing credits if that scheme is not going to be delivered. So there would have to be evidence of deliverability and early deliverability of that scheme. So yeah, that would be something that we'd very much have in mind.
Okay, well, I think some of these discussions could probably take place outside of the examination as well. I appreciate it'll be of particular concern to individual developers, but it's not a point I want to dwell on any further. Okay.
Okay.
One final point on septic tanks before we move on. It's the timescales point. Can you give me a clear lead in timescale, Mr. Courtier, to delivering that? It relates to tomorrow's discussion, really, when we have discussion about 5-year supply. Where we are today, how far into the future will it be before septic tanks can be offering credits up, in your opinion? Appreciate there's some uncertainties, but in ballpark terms, how far off are we from having septic tanks delivering credits for sale through the joint venture company?
I'd like the initial tranche of credits available through septic tank conversion to be available late summer this year.
And would that be based on the discussions you've had with those two estates with 30 and 100? Okay, that's helpful. Couple of quick questions on retrofitting, because I'd seen that had already been secured in Norwich or I understand is council owned stock. As we've heard, that will hopefully facilitate Anglia Square, perhaps with some additional headroom on top of that. You mentioned there's the potential to roll that out to registered providers. How far are those discussions progressed? Thank you.
Yeah, so I've had discussions with the vast majority of large-scale RPs in this area, and I think and I can fully understand this, I have no problem with it whatsoever, that a lot of those RPs would effectively do retrofitting, but they would protect their own development programs moving forward. But there may be some benefit in some of those registered providers, actually, because of, again, that geographical point. If you are retrofitting your housing stock in one geographical area, perhaps in the Wensum catchment, but actually you've got a development site in the Bure catchment, you can't use that retrofitting. So there's a benefit in trading through the joint venture. So there's at least one that is contemplating that as an option at this point in time.
Okay, but in the main, your understanding is that those registered providers are looking to give themselves some headroom so they're able to progress their own schemes. Is that the main focus of their retrofitting?
At this point in time, that the majority would be focusing on serving their own development program, which, as I say, I can fully understand.
Okay, thank you. Just moving on, is the partnership aware of any private nutrient credit schemes that are being brought forward at this stage?
No, there aren't. So in other parts of the country, there have been, but not functioning in this area. Obviously, Natural England are, as I've said before, looking at feasibility of certain nature-based solutions in this area. And as you've heard, and you won't be surprised, obviously some of the national house builders are looking at their solutions for themselves. Interestingly, it is worthwhile noting that at least two of the national house builders have also come to us to say, if we happen to mitigate, let's say through wetlands, and we over mitigate, so in other words, we've got excess over and above what we need for our own schemes, can we sell that excess into the joint venture? So, but apart from that, there are no other private trading mechanisms that are in place, or as I understand are proposed to be in place at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. There was a helpful update you gave earlier before when Mr. Warden was leading the sessions in relation to the progress with the joint venture company that's being set up. Just remind me, when will that be set up and running, and when will it be in a position to sell credits? Thank you.
So it's registered, and we're hoping to effectively go live with it. So we're working currently on the website and financing details and bank accounts and all those sorts of things that we need to set up the joint venture. But we'd hope to go live in April, all things being well. We've appointed a general manager who will be starting in May. and I would hope that we would be able to trade credits in a short space of time after the end of April.
And the very first credits you sell, do you have an idea where they'll come from? Which source?
Yes, at this point in
first
time,
tranche, I should say, rather than the very first credit.
First tranche.
The first group of credits. I'm not asking for which one gets its nose across the line first, but the ones that will come forward quickest.
So we believe, and we're going through we're seeking legal advice on this at this time, but we think we can schemes for solar farms, and we've got some very large scale solar farms that have been granted planning permission since March last year. So obviously post the announcements around this, we believe and understand that we can effectively acquire the mitigation arising from that land being converted out of agricultural use and into solar farms. At the very least, you could use the mitigation arising from the fact that if grazing has been allowed in between those solar panels and then we enter into an agreement with the landowner not to graze, then we could use that mitigation. The benefit of that is effectively in place already. The permission for that is in place. And so we think we can move fairly quickly on that. And we think they will probably be the first credits that we could sell.
And how many dwellings does that free up?
So from one solar farm, we are advised that is in excess of 200 dwellings.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. You mentioned before, sorry, tripped my sheet before I asked the question. You mentioned before, Mr. Courtier, that around 60% of the planned housing growth will be able to come forward with on-site mitigation. What's that figure based on?
Will you excuse me, sir? What I'm going to do, I'm now going to join back under my laptop. So, Mr. Burrell.
That's fine. It'll make it far less likely I'll call you or refer to you as Mr. Burrell with the correct name at the bottom of the screen. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me and see me okay?
Loud and clear, yes. Thank you.
Great. In the nicest possible way, it was a sort of a ballpark figure, and so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of scientific detail about it, but I think from recollection, it was based upon the fact that if the larger schemes of, let's say, over 600 homes will generally be able to find their own mitigation, then the remainder we may have to find credits for. The reason why I'm not telling you how much weight to give it, the reason why I'm not going to focus a huge amount on that 40-60 split is that we think that the joint venture can scale up or scale down depending on what that demand is, because of the nature of some of those large scale mitigation schemes that we can secure. But it is primarily based upon the fact and the assumption that those larger scale sites can find their own mitigation. And that's the evidence that we're seeing in the majority of those larger strategic sites to date.
Okay. And you're confident, or is there clear evidence, I should say, that there's capacity within the potential mitigation schemes that the joint venture company might identify to hit the remaining 40%?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Martin Edwards, just to come in.
Yeah, just to ask you a question, if I can, sir. We've talked or heard, sorry, quite a bit about the larger sites. Have any of these been tested to prove that sites over 600 can actually deliver what we're hoping to do? As I think that might be quite fundamental, both to the question 18 that's been asked, but also perhaps for tomorrow's hearing session as well. Thank you.
And just before I put that question to Mr. Courtier, by tested, do you mean in terms of having secured permission, or do you mean tested as in this has been proven to be successful elsewhere in the country?
Apologies, yeah, I didn't make that quite clear. Tested in the sense of how would a site of say 600 be able to to deliver the required houses and its own mitigation. For example, we know that a site may be only defined with a certain amount of land available. So if there is no further land, unless we test that particular site to show how it would be able to deal with nutrient neutrality on its own, I'm suggesting here we may be making assumptions that 600 houses could then be delivered from that site there, unless there is a specific test or a manner in which that site's been looked at. And apologies for not making that clear.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Courtier, did you wish to respond to that point? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, there's a danger that we get. I don't see this as absolute reliance upon the soundness of the plan or this approach, because I do think that the credit system can be scaled up or scaled down. However, my assumptions are based upon my conversations that I've had with multiple developers and promoters, and you'll have to forgive me. In a lot of cases, those are not in the public domain, but some of those have been in conjunction with Natural England. Some of them haven't yet, but some of them have absolutely relied upon their own professional consultants. And in many cases, in fact, I'm thinking the vast majority of cases, they do not rely upon additional land take and or wetlands. They rely upon solutions, whether that's, again, their own septic tank conversions, whether that is the additional infrastructure of their own treatment plants. And generally, to make a treatment plant viable, you need in excess of 600 homes, rising up to 1,000 homes in some cases. So yes, I'm comfortable and confident that for those larger strategic sites, they can find their own solutions, and they don't need to have large swathes of land taken out in order to achieve those outcomes.
Is there a distinction there, just perhaps picking up on the point that's been made? I'll allow you to come back in a second, Mr. Martin Edwards. Is there a distinction then between urban sites and which would be often be higher density, and urban fringe sites, perhaps on greenfield sites, lower density? Is there a distinction there?
I think that's a fair point. That there can be a distinction, but again, I'm sorry to repeat the point, but because we're not saying if you have more than 600 or 1,000 homes, that's it, you've just got to sort yourself out. That would be the first port of call, that we would be looking for schemes to be trying to find their own solutions. It may well be that some, even in urban areas, let's say you've got a 700 home scheme and you can find a way of mitigating 400, well, you could then take a hybrid approach and top it up with perhaps 300 credits. So we're not saying it's an either or, but we're looking at, again, I come back to, we're all in the same business here. We want to see the delivery of sustainable growth in our area, and we'll work together to achieve that. It's not no, you've just got to sort yourself out and you can't have access to credits. Hybrid systems of topping up would be absolutely fine as we move forward, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Martin Edwards, did you wish to come back on that point?
Yes, if I could. Obviously, we're representing Welbeck Land in an emission site in Wymondham, but to give people an example, because we've made this in our submission so people can readily see that. We employed RPS to have a look at this, who've been doing this type of work up and down the country for other authorities as well. We were looking at a site of around 700 houses ourselves, so it would be of that category that Mr. Courtier has mentioned. Depending on the calculator that you use, either the Natural England calculator or the Norfolk calculator, we'd probably be looking at a reduction from the 700 houses, somewhere between 500 houses all the way down to 260, if we were only looking at delivering something within the confines of the site that was available. And I think that the point to mention there, sir, is just to say that we have done that little bit of work, and it is to suggest that if we aren't careful, there could be a significant reduction in the number of houses that might be expected. And that's all I really wanted to say. And that brings in the point that I mentioned earlier this morning about calculators as well.
I do intend to, thank you for that point. I do intend to return to nutrient calculators in a short while. Just one brief point, again, perhaps a timetabling point. I understand, as I said before, that I think it was Ms. Leahy needs to be away by 1 o'clock. Sorry, Ms. Leary needs to be away by 1 o'clock. Are there any other points, just in case we run past that, are there any other points that you wanted to raise that we haven't yet covered, Ms. Leary, just to ensure that your points are raised before you have to leave?
No, sir, I believe they've all been covered. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Point now on the separate scheme being pursued by Natural England. It was mentioned before, it's set out in the Matter 4 hearing statement that the partnership have prepared. What does that scheme or schemes comprise, and when will it be delivered by? I'm happy to take a response from either Mr. Courtier or Natural England. Thank you.
If I start, and then either Keris or Louise can correct me if I'm wrong. So it was a scheme that was first announced under the ministerial statement, I think from recollection of June last year, where money was set aside for Natural England to progress effectively a credit allocation scheme. That's led to a team being set up, and although they have progressed that in the Tees, I think that's been more challenging, certainly in the Norfolk catchment, but they have done feasibility and mapping work to look at where the optimal sites are for nature-based solutions. My understanding, because it was in the paper, then they've gone out to procurement to carry out feasibility work for, I think from recollection, 5 sites. Again, that was in the paper, so I'm not saying anything that isn't already in the public domain. And they are looking to progress that work to try to deliver nature-based solutions. I would again reiterate that we see that as a positive, and we see our different allocation schemes as complementary to each other. So I'm aware, for example, that they're in conversation with one landowner about a reed bed. We're in conversation with the same landowner about septic tank conversion. We understand that. I'm not looking to duplicate that, but we're looking to be complementary in terms of those schemes. Okay.
When you say nature-based, it's things like wetlands. That's
wetlands, reed beds, absolutely.
Which have the biodiversity benefits in addition to the nutrient benefits. Okay. And presumably, I'm happy to take a comment from Natural England in a second if they can assist. Given some of the issues we discussed before about the need for these landscapes and these habitats to mature and develop, is that more of a medium-term prospect for delivering nutrient credits, given the need to establish, for example, a wetland? Again, happy to take comments from either Natural England or Mr. Courtier, depending on who's best placed to answer the question.
Okay, I'll chip in. Natural England is due to launch its nutrient mitigation strategy at the end of this month. As Mr. Courtier says, we're rolling it out first of all in the Tees catchment because it's a catchment that's affected by nitrogen only, whereas in the Broads it's both phosphorus and nitrogen, which makes it more complex, and it necessitates in Norfolk needing wetland creation to strip out that phosphate. So they are going to take some time to establish. As also alluded to, we are currently undertaking 5 feasibility studies for potential wetland locations in the Wensum and the Yare catchments, and there's a further 5 pre-feasibility studies planned for next month, likely to be in the Wensum and the Ant catchments. But until we know the outcome of these studies, it's not possible to say when we'll be in a position to sell credits in Norfolk. So it's very much at that sort of pre-feasibility stage of studies, and we are looking to develop the medium to longer term solutions here, mitigation measures, because obviously they're going to take a while to establish if you're talking about creation of new wetlands to be fully functioning.
Okay, that's helpful actually. I mean, I've got perhaps one eye on question 4 tomorrow, which is 5-year supply matters. Obviously, if this is a medium-term prospect, then that's beyond the scope of perhaps a 5-year timescale, or at least potentially beyond the scope of a 5-year timescale. Okay, is that a fair comment to make? Sure, I should add, is that a fair assumption to make? Is it that sort of timescale you'd envisage 5 years plus?
I think we're hoping to bring it forward before then, but as I say, until we've seen these sort of initial study results, it's going to be hard to put a sort of a timescale on it. Okay.
Ms. Whitson, did you wish to come in?
Yeah, just on that point regarding timescales. Unfortunately, with wetland creation as mitigation, the devil is in the detail, as it were, in terms of when the mitigation will come online, and Natural England have produced with the Integrated Constructed Wetland Association guidelines and methodology on how to construct wetlands, and if the wetland construction is adheres to the guidelines and methodology on how to create the wetlands, then it's a lot easier to determine the outputs and the actual effectiveness of the mitigation. So like I say, a lot of the devil is in the detail. So if wetland creation is done in accordance with guidelines, and we have a lot more certainty on that detail, and it should help improve the when the mitigation can come online, as it were. So yeah, it's important that there is a lot of detail that's required in these mitigation measures, and until you get into that level, you can't really determine when the measures can come online, but it would be at occupancy of the dwellings.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. A question I was going to ask of Natural England was, what was the reason for taking a separate approach and developing your own schemes outside of the joint venture company? Thank you.
Do you want me to take this one, Louise?
Whoever's best. Oh, sorry. If you.
Sorry. The national mitigation, Natural England national mitigation scheme was produced nationally as a sort of a direct result of the pressures being placed on the development within all the affected catchments. So it has been run separately and funded separately through what was the DEFRA and the Business Department for Business and Bias, whatever it was called. So yeah, it was seen as a sort of reaction to the issues the pressures being placed on development throughout the nutrient neutrality catchment. So that's why it's been run separately to the Norfolk local authorities approach.
Okay, thank you. Question for Mr. Courtier next. A point that was raised earlier by Natural England related to the need to monitor mitigation schemes to ensure that they actually deliver the theoretical benefits that they purport to achieve. How does the partnership intend to address that point about monitoring? Thank you.
So again, there is a degree to which it will depend upon the scheme, but we would be entering into legal agreements with the providers of mitigation projects, and part of that legal agreement would be the expectation for that scheme to deliver X amount of kilograms of kilograms of phosphate and or nitrates. So there will be a degree to which that obligation will either require them to show evidence that they are continuing to meet that contractual obligation, but ultimately there will be more widespread monitoring of the catchment. So we will recognise, and as already been said, there will be ongoing monitoring of the condition of our watercourses. So we'll get an understanding of the overall effectiveness of this programme and the trading of mitigation through the joint venture, but also the wholesale mitigation programme that we'll see coming direct from developers and so on and so forth. But as I say, the main control will be probably through the contractual obligations that the JV will impose upon those respective project deliverers.
Okay, thank you. Do either of the representatives from Natural England wish to comment on what Mr. Courtier's just said, given it was your point that I put to him?
I think as long as there is a legal requirement for monitoring of the outputs of individual schemes, I think that'll be satisfactory. It's just to recognise that as well as coming forward with these mitigation measures that will need maintenance and management, they'll also require monitoring to make sure they are fulfilling what they were designed on paper to do. So it's as long as there is that mechanism, we'd be satisfied.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on now to a point that was raised earlier. I think it was by the representatives for Welbeck about the difference in approach between the Norfolk nutrient calculator and the Natural England nutrient calculator. First question for Mr. Courtier, please. What was the reason for taking a different approach locally to the standard national approach? Thank you.
Myself and Lise Kerris and others from Natural England have had this conversation on numerous occasions, so I don't mean to cause any concern or angst, but when the Natural England calculator came out, we just felt it was over-egging it and overly conservative. And I think if you look at a lot of the press at that time, I think that was a view shared by a number of others. And so we appointed Rod Haskoning very early on to review that calculator and review the assumptions behind that calculator. In reality, there's a couple of main points of divergence, and one of those is the occupancy of new houses. So off the top of my head and from recollection, the Natural England calculator assumed a 2.4 person occupancy per new dwelling. What that assumes is that everyone that moves into that house is moving in from outside of the catchment, which isn't correct. So we commissioned ORS to do a bespoke piece of work which effectively modelled this, and they came up with cut a long story short, they came up with the assumption that the occupancy rate of new houses of people that are moving in from outside the catchment is, from recollection, is 1.88 or 1.89, which is the assumption that's gone into the calculator. So we felt, and in discussion with Natural England, they were prepared to, although they will still promote and endorse their own calculator, they were accepting of that evidence that we then put in as an assumption to the calculator. So that's an example of the divergence between us.
So just so I understand it, so 1.88 per household, that's a kind of net figure, is it? Assuming that, I mean, is the point that some households will form locally? So let's say, for argument's sake, someone leaves, flies the nest and gets their first home. They've formed a new household from an existing household, and there's no net increase of individuals within the catchment. Is that what it's based on?
Absolutely. So it's an obvious point. If you already live in the catchment, then in the nicest possible way, every time you go to the toilet, those nutrients that are arising are going to the watercourse. If you then move to a new house and it's also in the catchment, you're not adding any more nutrients into the watercourse. It's the additionality of people coming in from outside of the catchment that are then adding more and more nutrients into the watercourse that aren't already in the watercourse. Does that make sense?
It does, but obviously the housing market's slightly more complicated in the sense that
it is. Of course it is.
In the sense that whilst person A or household A might move from one part of Norwich to another part of Norwich, they might vacate a dwelling that's then occupied by someone moving from out of the catchment area.
Absolutely.
So does that difference only? It strikes me that the lower figure is the lower figure justified solely on the basis of households forming from within Norwich or within the catchment area. The example I mentioned before about someone flying the nest from the first time, that's a new household formed entirely from an existing household in Norwich. Is that what that assumption is based on? Because that wouldn't then vacate a dwelling which could be occupied by someone else moving from outside the catchment, would it? It's a new household forming entirely from within an existing one.
You'll have to forgive me slightly, because in terms of I understand and know the headlines from the ORS report, but we and Natural England were satisfied with the robustness of the ORS report, which recognised that, as I said before, as you build a new house, rather than the assumption that you are adding 2.4 people into the catchment as a result of that new house, actually that figure is, as I say, it's either 1.88 or 1.89. And that is therefore the assumption that we use based on that ORS report.
Okay. Ms. Oliver, did you wish to come in? You've had your hand raised for a while.
Thank you. I would like to just maybe correct a few things. And the detail is in our letter of the 7th of October last year that we wrote to the local planning authorities from our national principal advisor, which highlighted a number of concerns. We have accepted that it's the decision of the Norfolk authorities as the competent authority to determine the approach and the associated calculations that they're going to take, but we have highlighted that we consider the Norfolk calculator has a reduced level of precaution in the Norfolk nutrient budget calculator compared to what Natural England has produced. And I would just like to highlight that the Natural England calculator has there are court rulings that have found our calculator to be sound and robust. So we have highlighted that is in terms of using the Norfolk calculator, there's potentially leads local authorities or developers open to legal challenge on how robust and precautionary that calculator is. But as I say, we have accepted that it's the decision of the Norfolk authorities to proceed with their own calculator, having highlighted those risks.
And from your perspective, Ms. Oliver, where would the grounds for any legal challenge be?
Well, it would be whether it's precautionary enough with the data, whether it's the occupancy rate, whether it's the water usage as well. As I say, there's various points we raised in our October letter that just sort of highlighted the differences. And it's not for us, to say where there could be a legal challenge, but just where we have been challenged by third parties maybe objecting to a housing development in other parts of the country.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a comment from Mr. Tuddenham before we return to the partnership. Mr. Tuddenham, did you wish to come in?
Yes, thank you very much, sir. On population per dwelling, I've done a check on that as a matter of interest, using figures that are published within the evidence, and we had a population increase from 2001 to 2021 of 36,000 people, and in that period of time there are 18,051 new completions. That to me provides a population increase per new dwelling of 2.04 persons per dwelling, not 1.88. That's all I need to say on that, sir.
Thank you. Okay, does the partnership wish to respond to the points that have been raised both by Ms. Oliver and by Mr. Tuddenham either Mr. Courtier or Mr. Howell-Williams, whoever's appropriate. Thank you.
If I go first, I think it's worth noting that, and again, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, whilst Natural England have raised some concerns about the Norfolk calculator, they themselves would not be minded to legally challenge on the basis of that calculator. And therefore, when you talk about a legal challenge, that would come from a third party. I think the other point to note is that ultimately, the Norfolk calculator was intended to be a tool to guide and help and assist developers. It's not telling developers that that is the set of assumptions they need to use. It was simply there as a tool to help them in their calculation of the predicted nutrients arising from their development. So if a developer was nervous about some of the assumptions in that calculator, they can adjust those assumptions to their liking, as long as ultimately, as and when the matter goes through a planning application process and the appropriate assessment and condign weight is given to Natural England's comments, then that is the process, that is the test for the assumptions made, rather than saying the Natural England calculator is wrong or the Norfolk calculator is wrong. They simply make different assumptions. Both provide a tool and a guidance for developers to calculate the nutrients arising from their development.
Thank you. Mr. Howell-Williams, did you wish to come in?
Yes, only briefly, if I may, sir. Strictly relating to the comments made by the representative just now in relation to the potential for some legal challenge. I think there are 4 short, simple points to make, which will hopefully assist. The Natural England letter is not one that contains any challenge to the lawfulness of the local calculator when read fairly and properly. Secondly, the letter doesn't even suggest that the local calculator is likely to be challenged. Thirdly, the letter is quite clear and shouldn't be misunderstood or misrepresented to you. And I think consistent with what the Natural England representatives have just told you, it is there in a helpful advisory way, pointing out that there is what is referred to as a less precautionary approach. But that is in the context where, for example, the question of occupancy is expressly deferred to the Norfolk authorities. Natural England therefore support the use of locally relevant data to derive an appropriate occupancy figure for Norfolk. What is said by Natural England, quite understandably, as long as you're satisfied and have the relevant evidence, that should be enough. The reference in the representations from James Bailey, and indeed for good reason, the reference to the Wyatt case at the time of the letter in October, of course, have now to be seen in the light of the Court of Appeal's judgment on this case. And we can send that to you, sir, should you wish it. But the point to take is that Mr. Justice Jay's comments on relevant matters were expressly endorsed. And what he was saying is that it's really a matter for the competent authority to determine on the evidence what is sufficiently precautionary. I hope those 4 points are helpful to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. The point about the nutrient calculator was raised by the representatives for Welbeck Strategic Land. Do they wish to come back at this point and comment further on what's been said?
No, that's fine, thank you, sir. I take on board what's been said. It was raising the point that there are differences on there, and differences create elements of uncertainty. And I think our points have been made in our representations and what we've raised this morning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That concludes my questions under question 18. Are there any further points or final points anyone wants to make before we close the session for lunch? Mr. Bennett.
Hello. Yeah, I think what we've seen sort of through this session is again the point that I raised at the end or the beginning of 17 was that in reality there is inherently a lot of risk that nutrient neutrality adds to this plan and adds to its trajectory, which we'll come on to tomorrow, in terms of the number of homes delivered, the amount of affordable homes delivered. And it's clear that there are strategies in place that the council have worked on to get to the point they are and to get to the point they will be. But the issue is the solutions are still some time off. And be that the Natural England solutions, be it the council's JDV solutions. And I sort of tease up tomorrow is that there are going to be implications on specific sites' deliverability. There are going to be implications for the ability to demonstrate a 5-year land supply. There are going to be implications for the ability to deliver the plan overall. And again, that's not for the want of the council not trying, because they really are, and they're in a really difficult situation. I think that's, again, it's just it's a timing point and it's a risk point, which again leads us to our solution, that the solution to this plan to make it sound is to allocate more sites, just so that there is much more of a buffer to account for non-delivery and differentials between sites. You know, as we've heard others say today, you know, one site might be able to deliver a wetland, but that might take a few years to get on board, whereas another site might be able to deliver a package solution. But again, but you know, it all comes down to the differentials, and the more buffer and the more we spread that risk over additional sites, I think that is how, or in our opinion, is how we make the plan sound, from our opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. And as you mentioned, some of those points will be picked up tomorrow. Mr. Warden, did you wish to come in?
I take what Mr. Bennett says, but it's not within the gift of us as inspectors to allocate more sites. If we determined that more sites needed to be required in order to meet the housing need, then we would have to go back to the partnership and ask them to come forward with some sites, which would have to be subject to consultation, which would then have to be subject to examination. That in itself would lead to delay. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, we'll allocate some more land then, because we can't do that simply on the basis of what we've got at the moment. We're assessing what the implications are of the nutrient neutrality on the plan and what we might need to do in order to make the plan sound. But there are no easy solutions, I expect.
Yeah, I appreciate that, sir. Like, I'm sort of more teeing up tomorrow, to be honest. Thank you.
There's a hand raised from the representatives from Welbeck Strategic Land. Did you wish to come in?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I wondered if I could ask a question that's kind of encompassing question 17 and question 18 that we've looked at today. Going through the comments for question 18, we heard the partnership suggest that one of the ways the mitigation strategy could be successful is a monitoring process, which would be tied into section 106s, and presumably potential developers would have to pay for contributions towards that monitoring. I wondered if the question 17, the viability question, had that been looked at about what the costs of monitoring might be and how that would be pulled into the viability of delivery of different schemes, because clearly that's an extra cost contribution to the developer at this stage, which could potentially be unknown. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a comment from Louise Oliver next, then I'll go back to the partnership for final response, then we'll break for lunch. So Louise Oliver next, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's just a point of clarity. The monitoring isn't part of the mitigation. The monitoring is necessary to check that the mitigation is effective, and it doesn't have to be particularly onerous. It's more perhaps, say, taking water samples. If you had a wetland that was then discharging into a surface drainage network, to make sure that the nutrient levels in that discharge were as expected from the implementation of the mitigation measures, for example, but the monitoring isn't a mitigation tool. It's what's necessary to make sure that the mitigation measures being implemented are effective. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Courtier, do you wish to respond to the comments?
Yeah, and sorry, and again, it may well just be a point of clarification, but when I talked about a legal agreement, that would be a contractual agreement between the joint venture and the mitigation provider. In other words, it would be as part of that, if the mitigation is being acquired from, let's say, a series of septic tank conversions or even from angling and water, there would be an obligation that they would monitor in order to make sure that they are delivering what they said and contractually agreed to deliver. It wouldn't be through a Section 106, and therefore the burden wouldn't be upon developers to fund that.
Okay. Ms. Whitton, did you wish to make a final point? I see your hands raised.
Yes, thank you. Just a point in general about the mitigation measures and joint venture approach that has been discussed. As we've stated within our statement of common ground, Natural England are keen to work with the local authorities in Norfolk to find mitigation solutions for nutrient neutrality. But whilst they've had these high-level conversations with the joint venture partnership regarding the portfolio approach, we've yet to see any sort of mitigation proposals for specific measures, so to provide any advice on at present. So therefore we don't currently have any sort of sufficient certainty that any of these mitigation measures are deliverable at present. I would draw your attention to the role of Natural England as providing advice to local authorities, and that the local authorities are the competent authority under the habitats regulations, so they would need to have sufficient certainty about their own mitigation measures proposed for nutrient neutrality as part of development proposals in the appropriate assessments. And I'd also like to highlight that as part of the advice provided for nutrient neutrality in March 2022, that there are 7 principles to nutrient neutrality mitigation that need to be adhered to as part of being required as part of the habitats regulations in order to be considered robust enough and satisfy those regulations. I'd just like to draw that make that point.
Thank you. Mr. Warden, do you have any final questions before we end the session?
No, thank you, Mr. Hatfield. Thank you.
Okay. In which case, that draws today's session to a close and concludes the discussion on matter 4. Thank you all for your contributions today. In terms of the session tomorrow, my understanding is we're opening at 9:30, and we'll then move on to housing provision, questions 2, 4 and 5, as per RMIQs. So thank you all for your contributions. The hearing sessions for today are now closed. Thank you.